graphs and hypergraphs then just kind of drop out as the next thing you might think to do that isn't obviously stupid, and they work beautifully.
I'm very excited to be talking to Jonathan Gorard, who was instrumental in the founding of the Wolfram Physics Project and now heads the Centre for Applied Compositionality at the Universities of Cardiff and Cambridge. Jonathan, welcome to The Last Theory.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. It's a really great pleasure to be here.
I'd just like to start with your background. Could you tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to do research in mathematics, physics, and computation?
Okay, so, I guess I'm really a mathematician by training, but I consider myself to be someone who's... I'm the sort of mathematician whose interests are much wider than his skills. And so my formal training is really in functional analysis, differential geometry. I ended up doing research in sort of the mathematical aspects of general relativity. It was kind of the topic of my PhD, working on stuff to do with hyperbolicity theorems for the Einstein field equations, working out under what situations the equations of general relativity are well posed, that kind of stuff. So I've been interested, ever since I was an undergraduate, I was interested in mathematical foundations of physics and general relativity in particular. But my interests were always kind of a little bit broader than that. I was very interested in mathematical logic, foundations of mathematics, aspects of theoretical computer science, complex systems theory, lots of different things. I met Stephen Wolfram in 2017 and sort of started collaborating with him on a couple of different research projects, and joined Wolfram Research as a kind of part-time consultant and research fellow, working on things like automated theorem proving, symbolic logic, quantum computing, non-deterministic computation, sort of various random math and physics related algorithms, kind of R&D projects. But the reason actually that I was excited to meet Stephen and that I wanted to kind of get involved a little bit in that world was because back when I was in high school, when I was about 15, I read A New Kind of Science, Stephen's book from 2002, which proposes this kind of computational paradigm, right? This paradigm of thinking about natural processes as computations and therefore sort of translating notions that come from theoretical computer science to do with irreducibility and undecidability and universality and so on, and figuring out what they imply for the foundations of science. And I was particularly, there were lots of interesting things I thought from the book, but I was particularly interested in the sections on foundations of mathematics, but also on fundamental physics. And so I kind of, for several years, or a couple of years at least, kind of goaded Stephen about we should look at this. There are some interesting ideas here. We should really develop these in more detail. And so I did a couple of side projects looking at trying to sort of extend some of the ideas that Stephen had brought up in the Foundations of Physics section. And then in 2019, in the summer of 2019, there was this really nice confluence of factors. So Stephen had just had this idea for how to kind of greatly simplify the underlying graph rewriting formalism in a way that you didn't have to worry about symmetries of rewrites and stuff. And maybe we can talk about that later. But I had just made a sort of minor breakthrough about there was a condition that we previously thought had to be satisfied called causal invariance, which we thought was extremely restrictive. And I came up with a scheme which not only made it much less restrictive, but also seemed to give us kind of quantum mechanical behavior for free.
Yes.
And meanwhile, there was a third person, a student at the summer school that year, Max Piskunov, who had just spent about a year developing this wonderful software system called set replace, which allowed us to do very, very efficient graph rewriting and hypergraph rewriting through subset replacements. And so this kind of all came together in the summer of 2019, and we thought, okay, well, if this isn't the right time to do this project, then this project is never going to happen. And so we made the decision then to start when it wasn't called the Wolfram Physics Project then, but that was the point where it sort of started germinating from. And then we worked pretty intensively on it for the next 8 months or so, and then in April of 2020 we kind of went live, and we put up wolframphysics.org, and that was sort of the official launch of the physics project. And so I then, for the first year and a bit, I was the associate director of research. I think I'm still nominally the associate director of research for the project, but my duties have largely been divested to other people now. Kind of really trying to build up and guide the kind of the large scale research directions of the project.
Why do you think it took you and Max to kind of push Stephen into? Stephen had all these ideas, and he'd published a new kind of science way back in 2002. So this is 17 years later. Why do you think it took the two of you to push Stephen and say, "There's something here. We've got to pursue this"? Why did it take that?
Well, I think a number of reasons. I mean, some of which are to do with Stephen's own psychology and his way of doing things. I mean, so like he'd always said. I mean, if you read sort of blog posts and things he was writing, even shortly after the announcement of the book, even shortly after the release of the book, he was saying that he kind of the last big project that he wants to work on was to try and like find the fundamental theory of physics using the methods from chapter 9 of NKS. And he made a kind of there was a first attempt in sort of 2004, 2005, so a couple of years after the release, and then there was another attempt, I think, around 2008, 2009. But they were kind of fairly short-lived things. They were not really, they didn't amount to much more than just kind of a little bit of systematic exploration, a little bit of like enumerating graph rewriting rules and sort of seeing interesting behavior, which is it's the kind of computational zoology stuff that Stephen really likes to do. But that was really kind of all that it ultimately amounted to. And I think so part of the reason why it never took off was because I think Stephen kept getting sidetracked with other potentially more exciting projects, right? So there was Wolfram Alpha that were kind of, I think occupied a lot of his attention from around 2002 to about 2008. Then there was Wolfram Language, which occupied his attention from kind of 2008 onwards. And then lots of other random side projects that somehow were higher priority at every stage. Then there's and now I'm being a bit more speculative, but I think there was also a sociological aspect to it, which was that, so one of the interesting things that when one looks at the response to NKS, there was a lot of very positive response, and then it's fair to say there was a significant amount of negative response. Yeah. And it's interesting to note that actually almost all of the negative response was from physicists. People like biologists, even chemists, even people working on engineering. Lots of these people said, well, maybe NKS is written in a slightly abrasive style and whatever, but like there are definitely interesting ideas here. The only people who were basically saying no, it's all nonsense were people working on fundamental physics, and that's kind of interesting. And I think, again, my speculative conclusion is that I think when there was a period of time, so theoretical particle physics went through a kind of golden age in the 1960s, 1970s, maybe early 1980s, where previously people had been playing around with current algebras and Reg theory and whatever, and then there came a point where people settled on gauge theory, and then the standard models kind of came together very quickly, and then there was a big cottage industry, if that's not too much of an oxymoron, of people kind of like calculating scattering amplitudes and things using the standard model, and people were discovering new elementary particles every other week and whatever. Yes. So it was a really big furore of activity, which happened to coincide with the time when Stephen was still a particle physicist. And then afterwards, it kind of slowed down. Standard model got a bit more settled. People became then enthralled with the idea of, well, can we extend these gauge theoretic methods to try and develop a kind of a full theory of quantum gravity? And that really gave rise to string theory. String theory is really it's what happens when you take the kind of methods of gauge theory that worked for developing the standard model, and you try to kind of incorporate gravity. You try to incorporate the symmetries of the Poincare group into the same formalism of gauge symmetries that you use for the rest of the fundamental interactions. So in some ways, it's actually a very unradical idea. It's just kind of using the methods that already worked and trying to apply them to go a little bit further. So yes. I think in the 80s, 90s, there was still quite a lot of enthusiasm, after the first and second superstring revolutions and those kinds of things. There was still quite a lot of enthusiasm that string theory was the thing that was going to kind of bring physics to fruition, so to speak. Yeah. And I think when the book came out from that point of view at exactly the wrong time, because it was a time when people were still when the optimism for string theory was still very much in the air. And so people were saying, no, we've got a method, it works fine, we don't need your weird graph thing, like we don't care. And I think by 2019, I don't want to be too dismissive of. I like string theory. It's a nice collection of mathematical ideas, and it's.
I have to say, I don't like string theory, so I'm glad that there's something that's gone after it. But yes, you're being very polite to string theory, so let's go with that. That's great.
Well, I'm curious to know why you don't. I mean, it's maybe we can talk about this later. But so I have when I say I like string theory, I mean I tend to this maybe comes as a consequence of not really being a physicist. I often appraise theories much more based on their mathematical and philosophical elegance than I do. I'm not. Yeah. I'm not claiming that I think string theory is a plausible ontology for reality. That would be far too strong.
Indeed.
What I'm saying is that, there are these ideas like mirror symmetry, like, this realization that you can take these very abstract complex surfaces, these Calabi-Yau manifolds, and by making this crazy change of coordinates, you can make them isomorphic to a different set of surfaces, of K3 surfaces. That's an idea, that's an algebraic geometrical idea that was totally bizarre and that no algebraic geometer would ever have conjectured, and yet somehow it kind of fell out naturally from string theory. So it's a really beautiful collection of mathematical ideas, and it's had a profound influence on modern complex geometry, algebraic geometry, differential geometry, and so on. So even if it turns out to be hopeless as a theory of physics, I think it will have nevertheless been worth investigating. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to be mean to string theorists, but I think it's safe to say that the enthusiasm that was maybe still alive in 2002 for string theory, by 2019, was definitely dead. I mean, people had basically, all the low-hanging fruit had been picked, and anyone who was anyone was basically saying, look, string theory might be a part of the answer, but we need some new ideas. So I think there was much greater receptivity to sort of novel proposals. And that was another important component of it. And I don't know, I think in some ways, maybe it was not... another sociological aspect may have been that it was not immediately clear how you would structure a project like the physics project. Would it be a completely open thing? Would you offer prizes for, to the external community? Would you try and build some internal team? How would you fund it? Blah, blah, blah. And the way we ended up doing the physics project, at least for the first couple of years, which was really a kind of very small internal team doing essentially open science, right? Doing Twitch streams and YouTube streams and things where we did, for our working sessions. That idea that you could kind of stream scientific research, I think would have been really alien, certainly pre about 2015. And so the mode of actually doing the project, which turned out, I think, actually to be quite fruitful.
Yes.
Really only made sense, I think, at that particular point in time. So there was a variety of factors that I think came together, but I think those would be a couple of them.
That's fascinating. There's so much in there that's just fascinating from a sociological point of view. I mean, it's happened over and over again in the history of science where it's so difficult for the existing established community to accept radical new ideas because scientists become invested in the theories that they spent their entire careers learning how string theory works, for example. It's very difficult to say, okay, well, let's start again with this different approach. And what you say about the time being right, not just technologically, obviously, online collaboration is a lot easier today than it used to be, but also sociologically, people are used to online collaboration now, so the timing is right for that kind of approach. And
it's as horrible as it sounds. I mean, in some ways, I think actually the pandemic may also have been a non-trivial contributing component, right? So the fact that we chose to launch it when we did and that it ended up getting the amount of attention that it did, I think is not unrelated with the fact that we were in the middle of lockdown and people didn't have much else to do but sit around and listen to some random people talk about physics. There certainly seemed to be a certain type of audience member who we probably wouldn't have got if, the world had been kind of continuing as normal.
What specifically about this computational approach seems so compelling to you? What made you look at it and go, this could be right?
That's really interesting. So it was a couple of things. Okay, the first thing to say is that I think there's a very common philosophical confusion that happens when people think about models. People very often confuse the kind of substrate of a model for some kind of statement about ontology, right? So this is a confusion that's been replete in the history of science. So
absolutely,
the kind of the Newtonian paradigm, which oddly enough is quite what we now call the Newtonian paradigm, which is really a French concept, is quite different from what Newton himself thought, but whatever.
Yeah.
So the Newtonian paradigm was really based on this kind of Descartes, Cartesian idea of a clockwork universe, right, where you talk about physical processes in terms of mechanisms, in terms of clockwork. When one talks about that, no one is seriously saying that, the universe is actually a piece of clockwork. It's that this is a useful thinking tool for formulating a model, but it's not really a statement about the actual ontology. And that, I think, teaches us an important lesson, which is that the models that are the most useful thinking tools are generally the models that use concepts from ambient technology. So, the 17th century was really the height of clockwork, and so it's unsurprising that the analogies for how the universe works were all based on clockwork. But, we now live in the 21st century. The ambient technology is no longer, the kind of most up-to-date ambient technology is no longer clockwork, it's computation. And so it seemed obvious, at least to me, that we should, just as Newton, or at least people who interpreted Newton, sort of interpreted what he was doing as kind of an attempt to place the mechanism of the universe within this kind of this clockwork paradigm. It seemed obvious that kind of we should be attempting to do the same, but with the computational paradigm in the 21st century.
Yes.
Again, it's important to be clear because this is something which a lot of people, and I think you addressed this in your last video about you're skeptical about whether there is a kind of big computer that's actually enacting these rules. And it's a really important point to make because a lot of people, when they first hear the ideas of the physics project, say, well, we live in a simulation, or the universe is a computer. Not realizing that it's very different. Saying the universe is computational is an extremely different statement from saying the universe is a computer, like saying the universe is mathematical, right? So it's undoubtedly true the universe is mathematical. The universe is well described by mathematical equations. But it doesn't mean that, inside every planet is some person or some Mathematica kernel or whatever solving the differential equations of celestial mechanics. It just means that this is a useful way of encoding, the abstract states of our model onto concrete physical states of some system. And I think the same is true of computation. And in fact, there's a precise sense in which computation is a more general paradigm than these, because universality of computation, if you like, explains why the mathematical paradigm and other things actually work. Because it's, in effect, what it's telling you is that the axioms of mathematics are capable of universal computation. And so when we do mathematical physics, all we're doing is we're effectively simulating the computation that is our universe with the computation that is mathematics grown from these, grown out of these axiomatic systems. So there was a kind of largely philosophical point that it just, it seemed like if we really wanted to make progress in physics, then, an obvious thing to do would be to build models that made better use of the ambient technology that we have, not necessarily making direct use of the technology itself, but making use of the ideas that the technology kind of encodes as sort of raw primitives for building those models. Then there was another thing which is not unrelated, but I think is a slightly different point, which is, for me, the way I like to think about the physics project is not so much that it's a quest to find the fundamental theory of physics, although of course if it does, then that would be wonderful. It's a kind of way of answering a counterfactual history question. We historically have tended to formulate laws of physics in terms of continuous mathematical structures, in terms of differential equations, in terms of manifolds, in terms of smooth functions, all these kinds of things. And our choice of mathematical formalism has kind of percolated and seeped into our intuition. So we generally think of space-time as being smooth. We think of it as being continuous. We think of particles as having, as being able to exist in a continuum of different positions and momenta. We think of Hilbert spaces, spaces of quantum states, as actually being kind of smooth projective spaces, etc. But really, there's no physical reason to believe that's true. And, obviously, Democritus and Locke and Bishop Berkeley and lots of other people throughout history have kind of, have taken issue with this idea. People have advocated corpuscularianism or atomism or these other views in which there is some kind of underlying discretization of nature. So it's an interesting question to ask, well, why have all of our best models of physics been continuous? And again, I don't think it's because the universe is necessarily continuous and that's what's really being reflected. I think it's a consequence of the fact that, if you like, because Newton was born about 300 years before Turing, we had in calculus and analysis and the things that were built off that, we had a systematic approach for analyzing continuous mathematical structures about 300 years or 250 years or so before we had a systematic procedure for investigating discrete mathematical structures, i.e. Turing machines, lambda calculus, recursively enumerable functions, all those kinds of things. And so the way that I personally like to think about the physics project is that, in a sense, it's a way of answering, or at least addressing, the counterfactual history question of what would have happened if Turing was born 300 years before Newton. What would have happened if we had, systematic approaches for discrete math long before we had systematic approaches for continuous math. And that has, again, a bunch of other implications about, for things like, there are some more philosophical ways that you can couch the same idea, that it's only relatively recently from 20th century mathematical logic that people have kind of started talking about these ideas of constructivism, right? The idea that in the foundations of mathematics, that the only proofs that you should kind of allow and that you should consider to be meaningful are ones that are constructive, right? If you want to reason about some mathematical structure, you should actually give some finite deterministic algorithm that builds that structure. Because otherwise, if you just reason about it purely abstractly using the axioms, then you're assuming kind of consistency of the underlying axioms in a way that, the incompleteness theorems and things tell us you can't do in general.
Yeah.
And so there was this sort of philosophical movement that has its origins with people like Brouwer and Hilbert that seeped into the foundations of mathematics, this idea that you should build constructivist foundations, not just abstract axiomatic ones. And for some reason, that view never really permeated physics.
Yeah.
And again, one of the ways that I like to think about the physics project from a more philosophical standpoint is that it's a way of kind of, just as Brouwer's intuitionism, if you like, was a way of building a constructivist foundation for mathematics, I kind of view the Wolfram model as being a way of building a constructivist foundation for physics.
Yeah.
So there were various reasons why it sort of appealed to me, both aesthetically and philosophically, but those are maybe a handful.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There's so much that you went into there that I really wanted to get into. I'll maybe kind of interject in some of these conversations just some definitions, like the definition of ontology. For people who don't know what that is, it's basically the philosophy of what exists. So what we're talking about here is what actually exists in the universe. And if you're modeling the universe in terms of a hypergraph, does that hypergraph actually exist? And I think your point of view, Jonathan, is you're agnostic as to that. It's sort of like a non-question. Does the hypergraph really exist? Well, it kind of doesn't matter. The more interesting question is, if you assume that the universe is a hypergraph, what would the universe look like? And you can build up an entire physics based on that and then compare it with our universe and see if it matches.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a really good summary. And in fact, yeah, I precisely, I would say I'm broadly agnostic. And I wouldn't even be surprised if it ultimately turned out that okay. One interesting question is, could you even tell, in principle, right, if the universe was continuous or discrete? And it's entirely plausible that the answer is no. That actually, for you as a macroscopic observer, a universe based on a discrete underlying hypergraph and a universe based on a continuous underlying spacetime are really observationally kind of isomorphic, that they are observationally equivalent. For instance, one rather amusing way that could happen is if you have a hypergraph that's kind of progressively subdividing, which is kind of one version of the model that one can consider. Yep. You could have a situation where it's kind of constantly running away from you. So you build your experiment, you build your particle accelerator or whatever to test for discretization at scale X. And maybe there was discretization at scale X, but by the time you've built your experiment, it's now subdivided, and so now the discretization is at a much smaller scale. So if you imagine a universe like that, there are actually situations in which you can prove formally that no experiment that you could in principle do would be able to distinguish whether the universe was discrete or continuous. And so, yeah, exactly as you say, I think, therefore, the operative question is not so much what, is the universe a hypergraph, or is the universe an X or a Y? It's, yeah, exactly as you say. If we use a hypergraph as the kind of underlying data structure, does that let us do useful stuff that would be harder to do if we assumed a different data structure, like a continuous spacetime?
I've mentioned this before, but it must have been just a bit of a risk for your academic career to pursue these very new ideas. And I asked you this in Paul Borrell's Clubhouse room. It's about time, but perhaps you could explain again. How did you think about that risk and what made you decide to take it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it is a risk. And I don't know this for a fact, but I have a suspicion that maybe part of the reason why, we in the early days of the project, we got a lot of interest from people, and we still do. Every summer school, we get loads of people applying, loads of really bright students from all around the world coming and wanting to work on the project. So it's not really a huge problem, but I do sometimes wonder how much people are put off by the thought that, maybe if I do this, I'm going to somehow torpedo my academic credibility. And hopefully over time, as we become more established and as the literature tree grows and so on, that concern will become less and less relevant. But certainly it was a concern for me. I would be exaggerating if I said it wasn't. Yeah, so in my own case, the way I thought about it was, I felt like, okay, I had enough other, my PhD research was not on the physics project. It was on kind of more traditional mathematical physics. I had some other paper, I had several other papers on sort of, again, on maybe less controversial areas, more in the mainstream domain. So I sort of felt like I could afford maybe to dedicate a couple of years of my research time to working on this thing And even if it turned out to be a complete failure, which I didn't think it was going to happen, but even in the worst case scenario where everyone comes out and says, the emperor has no clothes, this is completely, there's nothing here, then, okay, it would be a bit of a blow and I would have wasted some time. But I suspected I could probably recover. The other component of it, which I know I did mention in the clubhouse room, but yeah, as you say, it's maybe worth saying again, was I kind of had this feeling of, well, okay, to be a bit, I don't know, existentialist about it, right? So, why did I go into research? Why did I go into science? It was because I wanted to investigate the nature of reality. I wanted to investigate new formalisms. I was much more excited at the possibility of really being being in the vanguard, being at the forefront of kind of investigating some new model, and really kind of trying to, at a very deep conceptual level, figure out what its consequences were. That seemed much more appealing to me than, working in some area like, say, string theory, which has existed for half a century, where all the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and where, even if you're really, really smart, the best thing you can seriously hope to do is to make some very small incremental technical improvement to some minor area. And my feeling was kind of, look, it's extremely unlikely that I'm going to have a chance to do something like this again in my career. It's a bit like if, in the kind of early 20th century, if I'd been given an opportunity to work with people like von Neumann and Ulam and so on the development of cellular automata, or if I'd been given an opportunity to kind of work on, to work with people like Turing and Church and Gödel on the original development of Turing computation and the various other models that are equivalent to it. There's a golden period of maybe 5 or 10 years after someone has a radically new idea like that, where there's a huge amount of stuff that you can do. There's so much low-hanging fruit. So many green fields you can conquer that really you don't actually, it's unlike these more established fields, you don't have to have built up a wealth of experience. It's something where someone who's very young, who doesn't really know what they're doing, can kind of jump in. You don't even have to be particularly good, because if it's a good formalism, basically if it's powerful enough, you can conquer new fields without really having to do very much work. The expertise of experts is very much at a discount, or the relevance of the expertise of experts. And so I felt like it's extremely unlikely that, if I'm very, very lucky, I might get one more shot to do something like this in my career, but probably not, right? Probably this is the one chance. So yeah, it was a gamble, but it was like the potential loss was, I waste a couple of years of my career and maybe my academic output suffers a little bit, but that's probably recoverable. And the potential upshot is like, I get to achieve the thing that I kind of went into research to achieve in the first place. And so that was, I'm not going to say I didn't agonize over it a bit, but it wasn't in the end a hugely difficult decision.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, when I think about what's happening now, like this reframing of physics in terms of computation, it does feel like this is a scientific revolution as important as, several hundred years ago, reframing physics in terms of mathematics. Does it feel like that to you, that that's what's happening right now?
I think so. I think that wouldn't, it's a strong statement, but I don't think it'll end up being too inaccurate. And actually, sorry, that brings me on to that's a very important point you make about just this general idea of reformulating laws of physics in terms of computation. Because not only does this relate to the answer to the previous question, but it also relates to the answer to the question you asked at the beginning about, one of the questions you asked at the beginning about why you think it took until 2019 to happen. I think another important point, which I forgot to mention, is that this idea, which in 2002 seemed completely alien, of like, that there might be some kind of intersection between physics and computation, and that thinking of physical processes as computations, might be a useful thing to do. That seemed really bizarre in 2002. But actually, the ideas behind quantum computation and quantum information theory, which really started to kind of take off in the early 2000, early to mid 2000s, and then the sort of theoretical aspects started to take off then, and then the more pragmatic aspects started to take off only in the last few years. The abstract theory of quantum computation, I think, made mainstream this idea that physics and computation were linked at some fairly foundational level. Right. So that suddenly the idea of saying, concepts like undecidability or irreducibility might have relevance for fundamental physics seemed a lot less crazy in 2019 than it did maybe in 2002.
That's interesting, yeah.
And that was another reason why, in some ways, I felt like it was less of a risky career move than it might have been if I'd done it, if I'd been sort of 20 years older or something and I had the same decision to make in 2002. I think it may have been much more risky because I wouldn't have had the fallback of saying, well, even if this all goes wrong, maybe
Yes.
there's something salvageable for some other areas. And actually, that statement about being salvageable, although it sounds a bit pessimistic, we've already kind of seen that, right? So there are already results that have come out of the physics project. So, for instance, some of the work that I did with Manojanya Namaduri and Zexis Asawala on these applications of multi-way systems to simulating quantum information, for simulating essentially quantum computations and simplifying quantum circuits and things like that, and using the causal structure of multi-way systems to do fast diagrammatic reasoning over quantum circuits. That's an idea that was spawned from the physics project. It's really an idea that you would not really have had unless you had the intuition behind the physics project. But even if the physics project turns out to be a terrible way to do physics, that's ended up having some non-trivial applications for quantum information theory proper that are really independent of the scientific validity of the other ideas. And my hope when I first started working on it was that there would be lots of things like that, right? And fortunately there have been. Lots of sort of spin-outs which, even if the central trunk turns out to be poisoned somehow, the branches that come out of it that connect back to the rest of mainstream physics, those branches will still be okay. And that's that's pretty much been borne out.
Yeah, I really relate to that, because when I was first studying physics, which is a long time ago, long before 2002, the idea of introducing computers was sort of looked at like it was cheating. Like, if you used your computer to solve your equations, it's because you weren't good enough at mathematics to solve the equations yourself. It's interesting how much that shifted, and I'm sure that's a significant factor in your decision to go this way. Let's talk about hypergraphs. Wolfram Physics reimagines the universe as a graph of nodes and edges, or to get a little bit more technical, as a hypergraph of hypernodes and hyperedges. And just for our listeners who've not seen my previous videos, in graphs each edge involves two nodes, and in hypergraphs each hyperedge can involve any number of hypernodes, so it's just an extension of graphs. So why do you think that the hypergraph is such a promising model for the underlying nature of reality?
That's a really interesting question. Okay, so I think it ultimately has to do with... Okay, let me make an analogy to another discrete approach to doing quantum gravity, which is causal set theory, CST. So in causal set theory, the idea is, it's the sort of... The nice thing about CST is that it's kind of conceptually the minimal discrete model for space-time that you could think of, right? So Penrose taught us that everything you really care about to do with space-time, you can encode in its causal structure, or you can encode in what you might call the topology of its time-like curves. That basically, space-time is some big collection of events. For every pair of events, that pair of events is either space-like separated, light-like separated, or time-like separated. And that gives us a causal structure. And that causal structure is invariant under conformal transformations, those conformal transformations encompassing both boosts in reference frames from special relativity, but also changes in gravitational frames from general relativity. So Penrose taught us really that if you know the causal structure of spacetime, if you know this partial order that tells you which events are causally related and which events are not causally related, then you kind of know almost everything there is to know about the spacetime, right? You in fact, 9/10 of the metric tensor is determined by the causality. The remaining 1/10 is determined by the volume. And so CST, which is a set of ideas that really goes back to Raphael Sorkin, had this idea that, okay, well, therefore we can imagine just discretizing spacetime by considering it to be a countable collection of events and then causal relationships between them, discrete causal relationships between them, which you can represent using a graph. You could represent that as just a directed acyclic graph called a Hasse diagram for that spacetime. And then, then the idea is that the structure of the graph gives you the causality, and then the number of nodes inside a region and the number of vertices inside a region gives you some discrete analog of volume. So immediately you've got some discrete version of relativity, and then you can start building off that. So this is a good idea, right? So CST is a good idea and an interesting one, and one that's worth pursuing. But the thing that limited CST was the fact that they didn't really have a promising dynamics, right? They everything that they were doing was really kinematical. They kind of said, well, let's start with a continuous space-time. Let's construct a causal set that approximates it, and let's see what we can reconstruct about the space-time from that causal set. That's a perfectly interesting and reasonable thing to do, and it's a good first step towards developing a discrete theory of quantum gravity. But of course, it's just kinematic, right?
Yeah.
What you want is some kind of procedure for actually building that graph, for building the causal structure that is your discrete approximation to the space-time. And causal set theory didn't, and to be honest, kind of still doesn't really have that. I mean, there are models of dynamics that have been proposed, things like classical sequential growth and quantum sequential growth, but they're really quite trivial and not very interesting. And the pathology that they suffer from is that they are dominated by very, very non-manifold-like causal graphs, right? Or non-manifold-like causal sets. In other words, the dynamics that they defined had the property that the causal graphs you get out of them, almost all of them, in fact, you can prove that as a theorem, you can prove that the non-manifold-like ones are so-called entropically dominant. So almost all of them have the property that they are very, very far away from being good approximations to continuous spacetimes, which is clearly bad as a model of quantum gravity goes, because, say what you like about spacetime, but it does a very good job of looking continuous. So we want our discrete model to be as close to a continuum approximation as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so CST had this problem that it didn't really have a good kind of growth dynamics. So one thing you might think to do would be to say, well, let's define some explicit algorithm that lets us build these causal graphs, that lets us build causal graphs, causal structures that are good approximations to spacetime. Well, how might we do that? So one thing that you want, and the thing that CST really suffered from, was the fact that the causal graphs you ended up having were highly non-local. That if you try to take this graph approximation of your spacetime and you try to slice across it to kind of reconstruct a notion of space, that the notion of distance on that space was very, very far removed from the notion of distance, the so-called Riemannian distance that we're used to in relativity, right? In particular, things that looked like they should be very far apart ended up looking very close together, and vice versa. So it's somehow the notion of distance, the notion of locality, all these things that you get out of these CST models from growth dynamics weren't very good. They were very far removed from the things we know to be accurate from relativity. And I should mention actually one guy who is a sort of predecessor of mine, so a spiritual predecessor of mine, Tommaso Bolognesi, who I think was really the first person to seriously suggest that it was worth investigating rewriting systems as a way of generating causal sets. So the idea there is you say, well, if I've got a data structure, I don't know, say it's a string, right? A string of characters. I've got some basic data structure and I apply some rewriting rules to it. I can look at the causal structure of those rewrites, right? Because I can say for some rewrites, they will have the property that you couldn't have applied this rewrite unless this other rewrite had previously been applied. So for instance, maybe the first rewrite made use of some characters in the string that were only produced because the other rewrite had been applied first. So you can say in some meaningful sense that the second rewrite caused the first, that there's a causal link between the two.
Yeah.
So the idea is you can use some abstract rewriting system, and this is an idea that Stephen really kind of pioneered in NKS, this idea of causal graphs for rewriting systems. You can use an abstract rewriting system to build a causal structure. So, okay, this seems promising. This seems promising as a way to define a dynamics for building a discrete spacetime. But what kind of data structure would you use, right? That's really the essence of your question. Well, strings are pretty bad, as are cellular automata and Turing machines and things, for various reasons. But one of the core ones is that they're far too rigid, right? If you think about a cellular automaton or a character string or a Turing machine, you have a rigid array of cells laid out in space. You have an a priori notion of space. First of all, that's pretty bad from a relativity point of view. It's a very rigid structure. It's very hard to see how you could make something like a cellular automaton compatible with Lorentz invariance from special relativity, right? How you would make things like length contractions and so on work when you've got such a rigid kind of register. And it also, it separates the notion of space from the notion of time. It separates the notion of space from the notion of states of cells. And, we know that there are these deep principles of physics, like in particular this principle of general covariance that basically says you can't do that, right? You can't neatly separate the notion of space from the notion of time. They're somehow, they have to be combined in some neat way. So those data structures that you might think of using clearly aren't going to work if we want a plausible model for physics.
Yeah.
So graphs and hypergraphs then just kind of drop out as the next most plausible, the next thing you might think to do that isn't obviously stupid, right? So, the nice thing about graphs and hypergraphs is they have an a priori notion of spatial distance, because you can just, if you want to know the distance between 2 points, you can just count how many hyperedges or how many edges you have to traverse between the two. And so because of that, their rewriting rules preserve locality. They preserve spatial distance in the causal structure in a way that these other models don't necessarily do. So that's already good, because it means that now, if you try and build a causal graph or a causal set out of a hypergraph rewriting system, it's much more likely to be manifold-like than if you just grew it from some more arbitrary algorithmic dynamics. Couple that with the fact that there's a very nice relationship to general covariance, because now you can make a correspondence between different updating orders in the causal graph and different rewriting orders for the hypergraph. And so each updating order in the causal graph will give rise to a different hypergraph that's produced by a different sequence of rewrites, and that corresponds effectively to a new space-like hypersurface. Again, this is not something you could make work with a cellular automaton or a string or a Turing machine or something, just because it has such a rigid notion of space. Because in a graph or a hypergraph, the notion of space is kind of maximally dynamic or maximally unstructured, suddenly you can make that work. And so it becomes much more plausible that you can have compatibility with things like general covariance. And so once you've discarded the other things that you might have thought to use, graphs and hypergraphs just turn out to be the next obvious thing, and they work beautifully.
Yeah, and it's almost sort of obvious that this is going to be the case because of some of the reasons that you say. I mean, you look at a hypergraph and it sort of already looks like space. It already has those kind of properties of locality. And although we draw them in space because we have to draw them on our computer screen somehow, they're not actually something that are in space. They are space. And so they don't suffer from any of those problems of those other approaches. One very specific question I wanted to ask you is, why hypergraphs? Would graphs be sufficient, or do we need hypergraphs?
So absolutely, graphs would be completely sufficient. And a lot of the stuff that we've done has just used graphs. And if you go back to the stuff Stephen was doing in 2002, it was just using graphs. It was using specifically these trivalent networks. So the reason for choosing hypergraphs actually goes back to the thing I mentioned right at the start about this idea Stephen had about how to simplify the kind of graph rewriting semantics. So when you... Okay, this is getting a little bit into the weeds of implementation details.
This is great. I like that.
Good. Okay. If you imagine trying to write a graph rewriting algorithm, how you would go about doing that from first principles, you very quickly notice an important problem, which is, so suppose that you've got a situation where, you've got a rule that takes in, say, a triangle of vertices with sort of three edges kind of coming out of it, right?
Yeah.
So your rewriting rule is going to extract out a subgraph that's sort of isomorphic to that from your graph, and then it's going to plumb in some new thing. Well, if that new thing has less symmetry than the thing you extracted out, so for instance, if it only has 2 dangling edges rather than 3, well, now you've got some ambiguity of how you plumb it in.
Yes.
Not only is there ambiguity in where you apply the rewrite, but there's actually, even for a single application point, there's ambiguity in how you kind of rearrange the symmetries so that, so the thing plumbs in correctly.
Yeah.
You can kind of get around the problem of non-determinism of where you apply the rewrites, but when you have rules that effectively lose symmetry, the fact that that introduces a new kind of ambiguity in the plumbing turns out to be a real pain to deal with algorithmically. So the solution it's a partial solution that Stephen used in the NKS book is to use trivalent networks, to use graphs where every vertex has exactly 3 neighbors. That solves part of the problem because you remove a lot of the symmetry issues that way, but you don't get rid of all of them. So you have to have some fairly coarse way of restricting your rule space in a really rather arbitrary way in order to actually make the graph rewriting semantics work. The annoying thing is that it starts out as a very elegant idea of, let's just use graph rewriting, and then the actual rewriting semantics you end up being very, very aesthetically horrible because you have to do all these kind of weird symmetry checks. You have an equivalent problem if you have a rule that adds, where the right-hand side has greater symmetry than the left-hand side. Because now there's, now you're going to be left with some dangling piece coming out of it, and where that dangling piece ends up, again, is effectively ambiguous. It's not determined by the rule and the location of application. And to be a bit more precise about why that's an implementation problem, if you think about how you would describe an event, how you would describe the application of a rewrite rule in a graph, well, for the most part, that's a very, very predictable data structure. You just have to say, what was the rule and what subgraph did it get applied to? But now if you've got the situation where your rules can add or remove symmetry, now you've got to have some additional piece to that event structure that says, well, how exactly do you do the plumbing? And how much information you have to specify in order to be able to determine the plumbing depends on the nature of the rule. So suddenly, the actual structure of your event is rule dependent. That's really unpleasant. You don't want that, right?
Yeah.
So this was a complete nightmare from an implementation and computer science point of view. Then Stephen had this realization that, well, maybe we're thinking about it wrong, right? Maybe we shouldn't think about these things as being graph rewrites. Maybe we should think about them as just being replacements of subsets. So if you think about just an ordinary graph, you could think about a graph as just being a set of ordered or possibly unordered, depending on whether it's directed or undirected.
Yes.
But just a set of binary relations between vertices, right? So in effect, it's just a set of subsets where each subset has cardinality too. Or maybe In the directed cases, they're not subsets, they are ordered pairs, which are just subsets of a slightly different form. But whatever. So you just think about it as being some abstract collection of relations between elements.
Yeah.
Well, then you could imagine defining a rewrite rule not on graphs per se, but just an abstract rewrite rule on subsets. So you just say, let's pick out 3 subsets satisfying this pattern, which in Mathematica has very, very nice ways of representing transformation rules based on pattern matching, and then replace them with another collection of 4 subsets matching a different pattern.
Yeah.
And when you translate it back, that's really a graph rewriting rule, but it's a graph rewriting rule where the plumbing is, if you like, taken care of by how you fill in the generated variables in the subsets, right? So the ambiguity that I was telling you about before, where you have a right-hand side of the rule which has less symmetry than the left-hand side, so you have to plumb the edges in some predefined way. Well, in the subset case, all that's really saying is that the new elements that you generate on the right-hand side of the rule either have to have the same name or different names from the elements that you started from.
Yeah.
If they have the same name, then that's like a plumbing, that you've effectively fused the vertices. If they have different names, then that's like a new generated vertex.
Yeah.
So A, that kind of solves all the symmetry issues that you get with trivalent graph rewriting as a stroke. But B, it means that, well, now if we're just thinking about these things as replacement rules on subsets, then there's nothing to say that the subsets in question have to have size 2, or the relations have to be of arity 2. You could imagine just doing this with relations of arity 3 or arity 4, or relations of kind of mixed arity or whatever. So suddenly you realize not only do you solve the graph rewriting problem, but you've kind of got a hypergraph rewriting semantics more or less for free. And that was this sort of rather elegant implementational idea that led to us considering hypergraphs rather than graphs. Not because we needed hypergraphs per se, but just because the solution that Stephen came up with to this problem that you get with graphs gave us hypergraph rewriting for free. And we thought we might as well make use of that even if we don't expressly need it.
There was another, while we're in implementation details, another one that I wanted to talk to you about, and that's about drawing the hypergraph. So when you're applying rules to a hypergraph, you don't automatically get a particular layout of nodes on the screen. And in fact, the layout actually doesn't matter. It's just the relationships between the nodes via the edges that is the universe. But it's nice to be able to draw these things on the screen so that you can show them in videos, for example, and show the universe evolving. So I guess the question is, how do you decide how to lay out the nodes and edges? Because the way you do so has an enormous impact on how the hypergraph looks when you draw it on the screen. If you lay them out one way, then the hypergraph has a particular appearance, and if you lay them out another way, the hypergraph looks completely different. So how do you decide?
Very good question, and it's, I know you've said this twice now, but it is really worth stressing that it's a very, very common confusion with this formalism, right? Where people see these hypergraphs kind of laid out in space, and they think, oh, the layout must have some significance, right?
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. It's a useful way of visualizing stuff, absolutely. But the point is, if the model we're using is accurate, then it's that the geometry emerges from the combinatorics of the hypergraph, not the other way around, right? So that's absolutely worth stressing. Okay, in terms of how the thing is laid out, that's really has nothing to do with me. There's a guy called Charles Pu, who's the head of the graph functionality in Wolfram Research, and he developed the sort of the graph layout algorithms for Mathematica, and he's really the guy behind how this works. So the default layout that we use in all the kind of Wolfram Physics Project visualizations and things uses what's called spring electrical embedding. This is a layout algorithm which you may be familiar with, but the idea is you kind of, okay, when you've got a graph and you want to find some nice visual presentation of it, what you're really doing is you're solving some kind of optimization problem.
Yes.
And spring electrical embedding is a very kind of physicsy way of solving that optimization problem. You say, well, let's imagine, and I should be clear, this is not physics in the Wolfram physics sense, this is physics in just like in the kind of classical physics sense. So you say, well, let's imagine that every vertex, every node has like an electric charge associated to it. So they effectively, every vertex is kind of repelling every other vertex. They act like they've got like charges. They obey effectively a Coulomb law with a 1/r² relation. Then we imagine that on each edge is acting like a spring. So each edge is acting like a kind of perfectly elastic spring, so it's obeying Hooke's law. So the restitutive force is directly proportional to its elongation. So now you've got these nodes, they're repelling each other, you've got these edges that are trying to kind of spring them and pull them back together again. And then you just say, well, let's start with some arbitrary layout, and then let's simulate that system and let's see what it produces. And for various reasons, it happens to be the case that spring electrical embedding produces very, very nice visualizations, particularly of complicated graphs. I can't completely explain why. It's some it's some weird combination of factors to do with our visual system and this kind of weird physics simulation that you're doing internally. But that happens to be the layout that we tend to use in all of our visualizations because it just happens to look nicest. There are lots of others that you could use. There's pure spring embeddings where you ignore the electrical forces. Yeah. They also sometimes produce nice visualizations, although somewhat less often. There are cyclic embeddings. Very often what we use for causal graphs is layered embeddings or layered digraph embeddings, where you actually try and show, kind of the beginning of time, if you like, the Big Bang at the top of the screen, and then you kind of have every event subsequently kind of trickle down the screen. That's quite a nice way of representing these directed causal graphs. But certainly for hypergraphs, spring electrical embedding is the default one that we use. The point you make about videos, by the way, is an interesting one, because that's a project that we've been trying to get done for a while now. We had a guy at the summer school, actually 2 years in a row, Dugan Hammock, who kind of worked on various iterations of this, and there's a new person working on this now whose name escapes me, I'm afraid, but might come back to me at some point during this conversation.
Yes.
But this problem of how do you solve essentially the kind of time-extended version of that same problem, right? So, normally graph layout or graph embedding we think of as being a problem where you just have a graph and you want to embed it on the screen.
Yeah.
And that's because normally when people talk about network data or something, they don't imagine the graph like evolving. But of course, in Wolfram Physics, the evolution of the hypergraph is what it's all about. And so what you'd like to be able to do is be able to make some kind of some video, some animation of this evolving hypergraph in a way that keeps it kind of maximally stable, right? Because if you've got your hypergraph being rewritten at every step, and at every step all the vertices and edges are in completely different places, it's impossible to sort of see what's going on. It's very useless as a way of visualizing things.
Indeed.
What you want is the equivalent vertices or the equivalent nodes and edges to be as close to their predecessors on the next frame as they possibly can be. And that's a kind of a different sort of, for one thing, it's a much higher dimensional optimization problem. It's intrinsically much harder to solve. And so one project that we're very interested in kind of seeing someone do, and again, as I say, the various proposals have been made, but I don't think anyone is obviously superior yet, is to find some algorithm that's the analog of spring electrical embedding, but kind of the time-extended version that lets us make these maximally stable visualizations of hypergraph rewriting.
Yeah, in some ways you say it's a more difficult problem, and mathematically it is, but in some ways you've got a bit of a head start because each frame of the animation gives you the initial conditions for the following frame. If you start with that initial condition, then just by the way that it works, it tends not to move too much if you use one frame as the initial conditions for the following frame. At least that's what I found. And I'm not using precisely a spring electrical embedding as you describe it, but I'm using something fairly similar that I think it looks good because the edges end up being all approximately the same length. You obviously get some longer edges because that's just the nature of the hypergraph. But generally, if you're using these kind of algorithms, the edges end up approximately the same length. And so it gives you a much nicer idea of space. If you think of, again, locality, nodes that are connected by an edge as being close to each other in space, then if all of the edges are the same length when you render them, then it looks a bit more like that space with all its properties of locality.
That's really cool. We should. I'm actually kind of curious now to see what it is that you've done. We should talk about that maybe offline at some point.
Yeah, that's great.
I'd
have to remind myself what I actually did, but it's not quite spring electrical embedding, but it has some of the same kind of elements, and I'm specifically optimizing for getting the edges to be the same length as far as possible, given the layout of the hypergraph.
That's really interesting.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about computational reducibility. When you apply rules to the hypergraph, you have to commit the computational resources to do exactly that. You have to apply the rules one by one to the hypergraph and all its complexity. With computational irreducibility, there's basically no simplifications you can make. You just have to do the computation from beginning to end to work out how the universe is going to evolve. But we know that there are simplifications we can make. There is computational reducibility in our universe. For example, we know that general relativity, which is a beautifully simple theory of space and time, holds in our universe. So there is computational reducibility. So how do you think about computational reducibility?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because this is a topic on which my opinion has changed quite radically over the last couple of years. So, yeah, I mean, computational irreducibility is a concept that I've been fascinated in for a while, precisely because, as you say, it kind of gets to the heart of what is possible in theoretical science, right? Because, if we think of processes in nature as performing computations, then, our theoretical scientific models are, correspond to precisely the cases where there exists reducibility. And everything that, and, the idea that was put forward in NKS is that essentially the abstract phenomenon of complexity we can think of as being associated to the situation where it is irreducible, where we effectively, we have the only option available to us as theoretical scientists is to explicitly simulate at every step. It's not like we can be very clever and write some equation that kind of spits out the answer, right? Because it's fundamentally irreducible. So that, certainly used to be my view, and I wrote some papers kind of even pre-physics project trying to kind of formalize different notions of irreducibility and figure out what they might imply for physical systems and so on. And I certainly used to have this view that, okay, it must be the case that things like general relativity or quantum mechanics are essentially situations where there somehow exists reducibility, in this what is otherwise an ocean of kind of irreducible behavior. I kind of don't have that view anymore. And the reason is because what turns out to be the case in the context of the physics project is actually sort of the opposite. So, okay, to make that a little bit less cryptic, let me make the analogy to fluid mechanics. So, when you've got a very large collection of discrete molecules bouncing around, right? As you add more and more molecules to the system, obviously the problem of like how you simulate it, how you predict what that system is going to do, seems to get more and more difficult, right? That we certainly don't have if you've just got a collection of gas molecules in a box and they're interacting with perfectly elastic collisions or something. We don't have some clever formula that you can just write down that tells you exactly where every molecule is going to be in that box after 100 iterations. You basically have to simulate it, as far as we know.
Yeah.
You can't, you can write down coarse-grained things. You can write down things like partition functions. You can write down the Boltzmann equation. You can make statements about like what's the probability that a molecule will be in some region of the box for some period of time. Those kinds of things. But the microscopic details of where is every molecule going to be, that, as far as we know, is irreducible. And that irreducibility has an implication. It implies what in fluid dynamics or molecular physics is called the molecular chaos assumption. That it is unpredictable, right?
Yes.
And in particular, that you have what's called ergodicity. That there's like no net. There's one way you could think about ergodicity is there's no net movement of molecules in any one direction, right? If you placed some surface in the box, right, the net flux of molecules through that surface, wherever you place that surface, as time goes on, that net flux is going to be zero.
Yeah.
And that ergodicity hypothesis, as it's called, that assumption of that assumption of molecular chaos is made credible by the fact that the molecular dynamics is irreducibly complicated. If it were reducible, if it behaved in some predictable way, it would be much less plausible that the molecular chaos assumption would be true.
Yep.
Okay, but that's really significant because it's precisely the molecular chaos assumption that allows us to make these statements about partition functions and Boltzmann equations and stuff like that. But actually, if we take that even further, it's the thing that eventually allows us to derive the equations of fluid dynamics, right? We know that if you have enough of these particles and they're all interacting in some complicated way, that there's a very coarse description of it in terms of a continuous gas or a continuous fluid or a continuous solid, or a continuous liquid or a continuous solid. And there's a mathematical procedure by which you can do that coarse graining. You basically, you write down the one particle distribution function for the Boltzmann equation, and you do this fancy thing called the Chapman-Enskog expansion that is really just a kind of coarse graining procedure by which you can derive then the stress tensor that appears in the continuum mechanics equations.
Yeah.
So in effect, the fact that we can make bulk statements about continuous fluids based on discrete molecular behavior, bulk statements like the Navier-Stokes equations or the Euler equations or the equations of solid mechanics, the fact that we're able to do that is a consequence of the molecular chaos assumption. It's a consequence of ergodicity, and therefore, by extension, I would argue a consequence of computational irreducibility. So you have this slightly paradoxical situation where precisely because the underlying behavior is irreducible, you can make reducible statements about its coarse-grained properties. Note,
right.
it's very important to note that the behavior is still completely irreducible, right? Something like the Navier-Stokes equations or the Euler equations certainly don't allow you to make statements about the positions of individual molecules. That is still completely unknown and would require arbitrary amounts of computational effort to determine. But somehow, precisely because it's chaotic, because it's irreducible, because it's complex, you can make large-scale, coarse-grained statements that are still meaningful, not about quantities at the level of individual molecules, but about these very coarse quantities like densities, pressures, temperatures, velocities, etc. Okay. So, as a consequence of the work that we've done on the physics project, I've now, the conclusion that I've resoundingly come to is that general relativity and quantum mechanics are much more like that, right? It's not that they correspond to cases where the laws of physics are, the underlying microscopic laws of physics are reducible. It's rather that they are a consequence of irreducibility, meaning that we can make coarse-grained statements that are still meaningful, right? Because neither quantum mechanics nor general relativity, in the way that they're formulated in the Wolfram model, are microscopic statements. They're not statements about individual hypernodes or hyperedges. They're not statements about individual configurations of subhypergraphs or whatever. Because I think it's safe to say that those things in general will certainly be irreducible. That if you wanted to make micro statements about individual hypernodes, you would have to do arbitrary amounts of computation. The point is, general relativity makes statements about concepts like curvature and dimension, which are concepts that only become well-defined when you're taking very large collections of hypernodes, very large sections of hypergraph that you're then coarse-graining out over and using them to make kind of effectively continuum statements. The same is true of quantum mechanics, right? In quantum mechanics, you're never making statements about, we haven't really talked about multi-way systems, but maybe this is a good time to start. But you're not making statements about individual state vertices or individual branches of the multi-way system. If our formulation of quantum mechanics in the Wolfram model is correct, you're only ever making very coarse, large-scale statements about whole branchial graphs, whole branchial surfaces.
Yeah.
So the same is true there. And so I think what's going on is actually much more analogous to fluid mechanics than it is to kind of conventional computational reducibility. It's that physics, and again, this is now less of a scientific statement and more of like a statement about the history of physics. Because of I would argue that because of computational irreducibility, physics has been forced to have its most foundational theories be formulated in terms of things that we can make coarse-grained statements about, that somehow therefore avoid that irreducibility. In the same way that fluid mechanics only makes coarse-grained statements about densities and pressures, general relativity only makes coarse-grained statements about curvatures and dimension. Quantum mechanics only makes coarse-grained statements about amplitudes and probabilities. And that's really an example, I would argue, of this, coarse-graining an irreducible system can give you reducible laws.
That's fascinating. So it's almost completely the other way around than what I described, that instead of general relativity and quantum mechanics being examples of computational reducibility, they're actually consequences of computational irreducibility.
I think so, yeah. I mean, the view you articulated was the view that if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I would have said the same thing, right? But it's, as I say, it's something I've changed my mind on quite radically over the last couple of years.
Let's get into causal invariance, and maybe we'll get into the multi-way graph here. So again, this is one of the most crucial concepts in Wolfram physics. So how to introduce it? If you think about the different orders in which a rule can be applied to the hypergraph, you end up with this multi-way graph with an unimaginable number of different universes, all connected by the orders in which rules are applied. But there are some circumstances where it doesn't matter what order you apply the rule in, you end up with the same universe. So this is kind of crucial for reducing this incredibly complex multi-way graph to something we can actually wrap our minds around. So can you talk a little bit about the role of causal invariance?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think it's actually, even though it's such a foundational concept to the project, it's actually a surprisingly difficult notion to talk about because there's a lot of subtlety and a lot. I mean, even when you make a statement like that, they are, the two hypergraphs are the same, or the two states of the universe are the same. That the same phrase, that conceals a lot of sins. There's a lot of deep stuff, behind that notion of equivalence, because there are many different notions of equivalence you can define on hypergraphs, and only some of them really have compatibility with causal invariance. But okay, so the way I would think about it, or the way I personally think about it, is again by analogy to the thing I mentioned earlier about the kind of Penrosian view of space-time. So, the lesson we learn from this kind of differential topology view of the structure of space-time is that really what matters is causal structure. And that's the one thing that's agreed upon by all observers in relativity, is if event A causes event B, or if event A it doesn't cause event B, if event A is space-like separated from event B, it doesn't matter how fast you're moving, doesn't matter what kind of gravitational field you're in, everyone's going to agree on that information, right? The causal structure is invariant. So that's saying that if you now imagine, you do the kind of causal set theory thing, and you say, well, let's now imagine space-time not as a continuum of events, but just as like a discrete, directed acyclic graph of events. What that's saying is that all observers should agree on the same graph structure. They might lay it out in a different way, but the graphs should be isomorphic, right? So now, in the Wolfram Physics Project, different observers, different reference frames, different gravitational frames, etc., are effectively parameterized by different updating orders in the hypergraph. Because in a sense, this requires sort of thinking about the notion of simultaneity. So it's like you've got some hypergraph, and you have a rule, and it can potentially match many, many different possible sub-hypergraphs in that graph. So there's some ambiguity of where you apply that rule. And sometimes the different hypergraph matchings will overlap, in which case you've got a genuine kind of divergence in the history of the universe. But if they don't overlap, if they're genuinely separated, if they're spatially distant, then although you could apply one then the other, or the second then the first, and that would lead to a kind of local branch, because they're different, they're applied in different places, those branches aren't going to conflict with each other. Eventually they're going to remerge. Yes. So it's somehow not a genuine branching event as it would be if they overlapped. So what that means is you can take an individual hypergraph, and you can think about it you could imagine kind of decomposing it into some maximal set of spatially separated rewrites. So some maximal set of space-like separated matches. And each one of those maximal sets of space-like separated matches is a different updating order, right? Because each one of those is a genuinely different branch of history that you could traverse. And any difference in the order in which you apply the spatially separated ones isn't a true difference in history. It's just a kind of local change.
Yeah.
In the intuition this is very, very deeply related to the notion of a simultaneity surface in relativity, right? Each one of these decompositions of our space-like hypersurface into a maximal set of space-like separated events is like a different choice of simultaneity surface. In effect, therefore, a different local choice of reference frame.
Yeah.
So the idea that what in relativity we would describe as conformal... It's important to note that there are various terms that get used in relativity to describe essentially the same idea. The idea that causal structure is invariant is agreed upon for different observers. In the simplest case, it's just called kind of Lorentz invariance or Poincare invariance in the context of special relativity. It's sometimes called conformal invariance in the context of general relativity, or diffeomorphism invariance, or general covariance in the most general case. But it's all the same kind of idea. It's if you make some change of coordinates that corresponds to a change of observer, that's not going to affect which events cause which other events.
Yeah.
So the question is, can we imagine making a corresponding statement for the discrete model, for something based on Wolfram model evolution? And so then the obvious thing to do is to say, well, for each of our different choices of updating order, in effect, for each of the different choices of maximal set of space-like separated events we could apply to a given hypergraph, we want it to be the case that the causal graph, the causal structure generated by that rewrite, is the same. That in effect, if you looked at all different branches of the multi-way system, all the causal graphs that you would derive by traversing those branches of the multi-way system should all be isomorphic as directed acyclic graphs. Maybe they won't be locally isomorphic, maybe at a given local point in time they might be different, but eventually they should all become isomorphic. That would be kind of the direct translation of the concept of diffeomorphism invariance or Lorentz invariance or general covariance or whatever. And that's precisely the notion of causal invariance. The notion is that, if you take a causal invariant rule and you run out its multi-way system, eventually all the causal graphs that you get by looking at all branches of the multi-way system will eventually be the same. Now, Mark, you then made this connection to a very deeply related concept which is called confluence, or if you're a logician, called the Church-Rosser property. But confluence, I think, is a nicer term because it brings you in mind of rivers converging and whatever. It's a much more intuitive idea. Which is the idea that if you've got a branching event in a multi-way system, that even though those two branches of history might diverge, they might be separate for a bit, eventually they'll converge again, right? Eventually the multi-way system will come back and they'll, once you kind of mod it out by all the different sort of local branching events, eventually there should be just a single thread of time that's agreed upon by all observers. That's a notion called confluence in mathematical, in the theory of rewriting systems and in the theory of mathematical logic. And clearly on the surface, it's somehow deeply related it seems like it should be deeply related to the notion of causal invariance. So now, as I say, this is where it gets a little bit technically subtle, because you can make it equivalent if you define your notion of equivalence between hypergraphs in the right way.
Okay.
Again, this may be getting a little bit too deep into the details, but I'll say it anyway just because it's useful to clarify. So it turns out if you choose the most obvious notion of equivalence on hypergraphs, hypergraph isomorphism, then the two concepts are not necessarily the same. Then they're mostly the same, but you can find these very annoying corner cases where actually where you can get confluent rules that are not causal invariant, or you can get causal invariant rules that are not confluent. Sorry, that way around.
Yeah.
Because one is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the other.
Yeah.
But if you use there's a refined notion of hypergraph equivalence that is the thing that, for instance, I've been using in all the kind of research that I've been doing for the last year or so, actually more than a year. The idea is, it's a little bit sort of almost blockchainy in its nature. The idea is that, okay, sorry, let me step back one second. You've got a hypernode in a hypergraph. Does that hypernode have some identity, right?
Yeah.
One possibility is you just say, well, all hypernodes they're just anonymous, right? All hypernodes are just defined structurally. And that's, for the purpose of doing hypergraph rewriting, that's mostly what you think of saying. But when you trace causality, you can't do that anymore. Because in order to have a notion of causality, you need to be able to say, well, our definition of causality is you say, well, event A causes event B if the input for event B made use of hyperedges or hypernodes that were produced by the output of event A. Well, be able to do that, you need to have some well-defined notion of, were those two hypernodes or hyperedges the same? So they can't be purely anonymous. There has to be some persistent notion of identity. Yeah. So what persistent notion of identity do you use? Do you just arbitrarily assign the nodes names? That seems a bit weird. Well, the idea that I kind of became quite taken with, which, as I say, is really a somewhat distributed ledger sort of idea, is you say, well, let's identify each node with its causal history. So each node, you say, okay, it's identified by, you define the causality in a slightly recursive way.
Yeah.
Yeah, the causality is defined in the way I just defined. The input for one event makes use of edges or nodes that were produced by the output of another event. But the way that the identities of the nodes and edges is maintained is by looking at their causal histories. So if their causal histories are identical, then the nodes or edges are considered to be identical, that they effectively can be swapped without changing the structure of the system. Whereas if two nodes or two edges have different causal histories, then a swapping operation will genuinely change the behavior of the system. That's sort of that's the intuition. So if that's your notion of equivalence, then causal invariance and confluence become the same idea, more or less trivially, because then you're basically saying, well, I treat two hypergraphs as being the same only in the case where their causal histories are identical. And then there's no ambiguity anymore. So, and that way of essentially assigning identities to nodes and edges turns out to solve a handful of other problems as well. But one of the nice conceptual features that it has is that this discrepancy between causal invariance and confluence that would otherwise exist goes away as soon as you introduce that as your notion of identity.
Oh, that's great. I'm going to have to think about that a lot more, but that's I'm glad you got into the details of the equivalence of the nodes and how you're thinking about labeling them effectively. Instead of just labeling them number 1, number 2, node number 3, node number 4, you're actually looking at their causal histories and labeling them that way. Yeah.
And I should say, to be clear on why I found the notion of just arbitrarily assigning them names to be unsatisfactory, it's because, again, when you try and define a notion of causality, which is, of course, really foundational if you want to try and make this a model of physics, that idea of just arbitrarily assigning names to stuff, like using generated variables, which is what we were doing before, has, in my opinion, an extremely undesirable feature, which is that it can introduce what I refer to as spurious causality, spurious causal relations. In effect, because you can have an event that does nothing, except it just happens to kind of touch a single node or a single edge or something.
Yes.
When it touches it, it generates a new name for it, because that's how the algorithm works.
Yeah.
And so now all subsequent events that make use of that node will appear to be causally related to this other event that didn't actually do anything. It didn't change anything about the structure of the hypergraph. It just touched an edge and changed some names. But now that thing is causally related to a whole bunch of other events into the future, even though it had no actual material effect on the hypergraph. And I found this very, very disturbing as an idea. That you so it was in the quest to try and find a sensible causal semantics for these models, which is actually something one of the big projects I'm working on right now is trying to sort of really refine and hone the notions of causality that we use in these models. But it was part of that quest that I came up with this notion of, well, maybe we should do the merging based on causal history, and it led to this idea which I called causal multi-way systems, which has kind of been a foundational piece of some of the stuff I've done since.
Certain rules have this property then of causal invariance. So how do you find causally invariant rules?
Yeah, that's tricky to do. The first serious piece of work that I did on the physics project was exactly on this. In the summer of 2019, because I was sort of weirdly placed that I had this background in developing automated theorem proving tools, it seemed like the obvious thing that Stephen, Max, and I agreed on doing was to see if we could find a way to use automated theorem proving technology to say, well, given a rule, can we prove whether or not it's causal invariant? And so I developed a kind of causal invariance theorem prover that we used during the early phase of the project, and then eventually it got incorporated into some other functionality that we were building, which is still available in the I should clarify, Mark, as you well know, but it's worth saying that all the functionality that we use for kind of analyzing these models, evolving these models, extracting data about dimension and curvature and all this kind of stuff, all the code is freely available in the Wolfram function repository. If you have a version of Wolfram Engine or Mathematica, or even the free version of Wolfram Programming Lab or whatever, you can go and use our functions. One of the principles we try to have, and certainly I try to have, and I know Stephen does too, is that we shouldn't have any pictures if we write a paper or a bulletin or a blog post or something, there shouldn't be a picture in that thing that someone who has access to a version of Mathematica can't in principle reproduce. And that's a general principle we've tried to stick to. So there's a bunch of functionality that I developed, like things like, well, there's a function called causal invariant Q and total causal invariant Q. There are other more refined functions for doing similar things that effectively do these algorithmic determinations of causal invariance. And I mean, it's a little bit hard to articulate in words exactly what the automated theorem prover is doing, but effectively what it does is, so both hypergraph rewrites and the causality of hypergraph rewrites have some algebraic structure. So when you've got hypergraph rewrites, you can compose them in sequence. You can do, rewrite one, then rewrite two. And you can also compose them in parallel. You can have two branches of the multi-way system. One does rewrite one does rewrite two. And those are algebraic operations. One is effectively like a kind of generalization of matrix multiplication. The other is like a kind of generalization of a tensor product operation. And they satisfy certain properties. So for instance, the sequential composition is always going to be associative. The parallel composition is always going to be associative and commutative. So it doesn't matter how you parenthesize the composition, it's always going to give the same answer. And when you're composing them in parallel, it doesn't matter in what order you do the parallel composition, it's always going to give you the same multi-way system. And similarly, the causal relations between these events have some algebraic properties. They also have a tensor product structure, although it's a slightly different kind, called a partial monoidal structure, etc. So anyway, without wanting to get too into the details, basically, I worked out that there was a finite set of axioms that defined essentially the algebraic structure of multi-way rewrites and multi-way causality. And then I fed those axioms into an automated theorem proving system, and then encoded the statement of causal invariance as a theorem, right? So it's saying from these axioms that we know have to be satisfied for how hypergraph rewrites compose and how causal relations compose, can we prove that the causal structure is going to be the same, independent of the order of composition of these hypergraph rewrites?
Yeah.
So I essentially took the statement of causality and reduced it to a purely algebraic statement that could then be fed into an automated theorem proving algorithm. And it's not foolproof, because obviously in general it's going to be an undecidable problem. But there are these simple cases where you can actually prove formally, yes, this is causal invariant, or no, we can find a counterexample where this is not going to be causal invariant. And again, certainly during the early stages of the physics project, where we were actively doing these systematic searches for causal invariant rules, that was functionality that got used quite a lot, and there are now more optimized versions of that exist in the function repository.
So effectively that's one characteristic of an interesting rule. If a rule is causally invariant, then that's very interesting. The consequences for choosing or finding a rule that might correspond to our universe. So what other characteristics are there of rules that make rules interesting to explore further?
That's really interesting. Okay, so that's a very good question, because in a sense there's a sort of tension there, or maybe a slight tension between interestingness and plausibility, right? You can have rules that are extremely interesting, that produce very bizarre, weird structures, but are like clearly not good as models for physics.
Yeah.
So you want your rules to be interesting enough that they're plausible as physical models, but not so interesting that they are, that they're clearly not corresponding to our universe. There's a nice sweet spot in the middle, which is mostly where we've tended to focus. Although I think there is also, independent of physics, there is obviously, I think, inherent worth in just going and exploring the space of hypergraph rewriting rules for seeing what interesting computational structures you can find. But okay, so in terms of rules that are interesting enough, but not so interesting that they become implausible. So causal invariance is one, absolutely. I mentioned this kind of manifold-like property that's relevant for determining, is this a plausible model for a discrete model for a space-time? That's something which, again, is relatively easy to determine, although a little bit subtle. Proving that this determination actually works and corresponds with our intuitive notions of manifold-likeness took several months of effort. But basically the idea is, so suppose you look at a causal graph for a hypergraph rewriting system, and you look at a pair of events in that causal graph that are not causally related, so they're space-like separated. So they correspond to two events that are kind of not interfering with each other in the hypergraph. They're spatially separated. Well, there's a notion of distance that you can define purely at the level of the causal graph on space-like separated events. In fact, there are several notions of distance, but one very easy one that you could imagine defining is, I just look at the causal future of those two events, and I look at the causal past of those two events, and I take the minimum of the time-like distances to their causal future and causal past. So basically, I kind of plot out some sort of diamond that the events are defining, and then I look at like the height of that diamond, or maybe half the height of that diamond.
Yeah.
And if you think about the geometrical intuition, if you think about the continuum spacetime now, so you look at two events in spacetime, you look at they form essentially there's like a causal cone, or two causal cones that they form, one into the future, one into the past. So they are like on the base of that cone. Then clearly from the height of that cone, or from the volume of that cone, you should be able to infer the radius of the cone, or the radius of the base. In other words, you should be able to work out how far apart the two events are based on certain geometrical properties of that cone. So you can imagine you can do the same construction with a causal graph. You can just look at two events that are space-like separated, look at their causal history, look at their causal future, find their point of intersection, use that to build a kind of discrete cone, and then use the volume of that cone or the height of the cone or something to infer the space-like distance between the events. So there's a notion of space-like distance that exists purely at the level of the causal graph, without you actually having to know the details of the hypergraph.
Yeah.
Well, there's a theorem, which is actually in my paper on algorithmic causal sets from the end of 2020, which basically says that one way you can characterize what it means for a causal graph to be manifold-like or space-time-like is that its notion of space-like distance should correspond to the notion of space-like distance on the hypergraph itself. So in other words, if two events appear more distant in the causal graph with relation to this kind of cone metric, then the places where those events got applied on the hypergraph should have greater hypergraph distance between them, and vice versa. There should be some monotonic relationship between these two notions of distance. And it turns out that the monotonicity of that relationship is a way that you can characterize how manifold-like a certain hypergraph rewriting rule is, or how manifold-like the space-time is that it generates. So you can actually quantify how close is this Wolfram model rule to generating a truly continuous spacetime. If it's arbitrarily close, then it will become that relationship will be arbitrarily close to being linear. Yeah. That's another slightly more abstract characterization that's really useful for finding rules that are generating things that are plausible spacetime models. There are much simpler heuristics that you can use to try and determine the same thing, though. So for instance, one of those is dimension, right? So there's a way, which I know you've talked about in the series, there's a way you can very easily determine a kind of approximation to the dimension of a hypergraph or a causal graph by just looking at a discrete ball or a discrete cone in that graph and looking at how the number of nodes in that cone or that ball grows with its radius or its size, and then looking at the exponent in that scaling relation. That exponent gives you some approximation to dimension. And then you can start to look at things. Okay, so for instance, there's a class of hypergraph rewriting rules that give hypergraphs and or causal graphs where the dimension diverges to infinity, right? That's clearly not going to be good for a model of physics. Or there are others where it converges to being one-dimensional or two-dimensional or something. There are others which are also interesting, but again, maybe not plausible as models of physics, which converge to being like 2.37 dimensional or something.
Yes.
That's probably too far away from 3 dimensions to be useful as a model of physics, but it's, again, one thing that the Wolfram model allows us to do in a way that conventional physical formalisms don't allow us to do is to really investigate questions about what it means to have a gravitational theory in a fractional number of space-time dimensions. That's not something which you really have the tools to address with conventional methods of differential geometry.
Yeah.
But, suddenly if you've got a discrete data structure, you can ask questions about like, what do the Einstein equations look like in 5.3 dimensions? It's a question that suddenly becomes well posed. But that's another thing that we use as a filter is, what's the dimension doing? Is it obviously blowing up to infinity? Is it obviously converging to 1? Is it converging to some finite but sort of clearly fractional, dimension that's not close to 3 or 4 or whatever? Those are things we can look at. We can look at things like behavior of the curvature. We can look at behavior of other kind of continuum functions. There are more refined conditions we can look at. There are certain classes of discrete differential operators you can define on hypergraphs, like the discrete Laplacian and things. And they can also give you kind of characterizations of how close is this hypergraph to being manifold-like. And again, we can truncate searches by looking at, for instance, you can define this discrete operator that's really just a kind of big matrix on the hypergraph. And then you can look at the eigenvalues of that matrix. You can look at its discrete spectrum. And again, if the hypergraph is manifold-like, or is going to converge to something manifold-like, then there are linear algebraic theorems that tell you, or functional analytic theorems that tell you how those eigenvalues should behave, how the spectrum should behave if it's close to being a manifold. And again, we can discard rules where the eigenstructure is really weird and differs a lot from what we'd expect it to be if it were a good approximation to a continuous spacetime. There are lots of things like that. I mean, we probably have a list of maybe 20, 25 filters that in principle we can use.
Are you searching for just one rule, or are you searching for multiple rules, or this gets into the whole concept of the Roolead? Is it possible that all rules could be applied to the universe?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say I don't think we're searching for one rule. That's something where I think the branding of the project has maybe changed. There was a TED talk that I know Stephen gave back in like 2010 or something, where he really talked about this as a serious thing he wanted to try to do.
Yeah.
He famously said, before the end of the decade, I want to launch a project to try and find the fundamental theory of physics. And he very much couched it in these terms of, we're going to do a systematic search and we're going to see if we can find the rule for our universe.
Yeah.
I don't consider that to be particularly plausible, and I don't think Stephen does either anymore.
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes down to the thing we said at the beginning about, I mean, you made the very important point about, I and many other people are essentially agnostic about, whether the universe is really discrete or continuous. And again, I said part of the reason that I have that almost apathy to the underlying ontology is because I think that there's a sense in which we can say, okay, we can define a kind of equivalence class or a congruence class of different models that all have the same observational consequences. And then if they have the same observational consequences, it's really a kind of, it's only on philosophical or aesthetic criteria that we can say that one of these is more accurate or better as a model of physics than the other.
Yeah.
The analogy that I use quite a lot is Lagrangian versus Hamiltonian mechanics, right? So, Lagrangian and Hamiltonian mechanics are mathematically equivalent. They are observationally equivalent. It's not like, it's not like one is right and one is wrong. You can't do an experiment that distinguishes Lagrangian and Hamiltonian mechanics. But ontologically, they're very different.
Yeah.
Hamilton's equations are very local in time, whereas, Lagrangian mechanics is teleological. It's kind of global in time. It's about shaping the behavior of the system towards some teleological goal. But of course, we know you can derive Hamilton's equations from the Lagrange principle and vice versa. And, we see the same thing with interpretations of quantum mechanics and lots of other things. And I think that teaches us an important lesson, that actually when it comes to kind of fundamental theories, the best I think we can reasonably hope for is some kind of equivalence class of theories that maybe have very different ontologies, but are observationally isomorphic. And so that's, in a sense, I think the best case scenario for this model too, is that I don't think it's the case we'll find one rule that reproduces physics. What we might be able to find in the best case is some equivalence class of rules that produce hypergraph behaviors that are all compatible with observations that we're able to make of the physical universe. And there might be some nice characterization for what those rules have in common that mean that they effectively successfully reproduce physics. But I think it's extremely unlikely that we'll have any kind of systematic scientific way of distinguishing which one of those rules is correct. I think, just as everyone has their favorite interpretation of quantum mechanics, probably everyone will end up having their favorite hypergraph rule that reproduces observed phenomena.
So there'll be religious wars over which rule is right, even though there's no way to actually provably choose one over the other.
Well, I guess that depends how pessimistic you are about the human condition, but it's certainly not implausible that something like that might happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so you bring up this point about the Roolead. I mean, to lay my own cards on the table, I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical about the usefulness of the Rulliad as a concept. I mean, I think it's useful as a thinking tool. That's maybe the charitable way I can formulate it. When you think about trying to devise a fundamental model for a phenomenon like the physical universe, there are kind of two, particularly if it's based on computation, there are sort of two extremes that you could try and use. And it's actually, again, it's related to the thing I mentioned at the beginning about the kind of axiomatic view of mathematics versus the constructivist view of mathematics. So the constructivist view, which is a kind of extreme bottom-up view, is like you start from nothing. You start from some very basic computational structure, like a hypernode or whatever. And then you build up from there to the phenomenon that you're trying to explain. That's the essence of constructivism or bottom-up model building. Then there's what in mathematics you would characterize as the axiomatic view, or the kind of top-down view of science, which is more like you say, well, let's start from all possible structures, let's start from all possible computations or something, and then let's make restrictions, let's impose constraints that eventually get us down to the thing that we want to explain, or we want to observe or measure or whatever. And that's really what mathematical axioms do. In mathematics, you have what is often called the domain of discourse, or for set theory, it's the universe of all possible sets. And then you write down axioms that restrict, that place restrictions on precisely which sets you're talking about, until eventually you've unambiguously defined a group or a ring or a topological space or whatever it is. So traditional axiomatic mathematics is much more like this top-down view, and the fancy, rebellious 20th century constructivist, intuitionist view of mathematics is much more like this kind of bottom-up view. So traditionally, with the physics project, we've tended to think in this bottom-up way of like, we start from nothing and we try and build up these models. But the point is that you could also imagine considering the extreme top-down view where you start from all possible computations being instantiated and you make restrictions. And that's really, I think, to the extent that I understand it, that's really, I think, what the kind of Rulliad idea is about.
Yeah.
And my own philosophical leanings are that, okay, I think that both things are useful as thinking tools, but like all extremes, I think that the most fruitful, I'm very much a kind of middle ground kind of person. I think we can learn useful things from both approaches, but I think ultimately the model that will end up being most useful in the sense of being somehow minimal or most elegant or minimal with respect to algorithmic information theory or something will end up having features of both. It will be somewhere in the middle. It won't be completely bottom up, but it also won't be completely top down.
The obvious thing to do once you have a rule is apply it to a hypergraph and see what happens if you experimented with applying, say, two different rules to a hypergraph and see how they interact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one way that you can start to get very non-trivial multi-way structure. So the multi-way systems we talked about so far have been multi-way systems where the branchings are because you've got one rule, but it can be applied in multiple places or something, or multiple different ways. But you can also get multi-way systems where some of the branching, at least, is because there are multiple rules that you could apply.
Yeah.
And this gives rise to these things called rulio multi-way systems, which actually Xerxes and I, along with Hatem El-Shatlawi, did some fairly systematic kind of mathematical investigation of over the last couple of years. So with rulio multi-way systems, the idea is, you start by just adding more and more hypergraph rewriting rules. And in particular, eventually you could exhaust all the hypergraph rewriting rules of a given signature, right? So you can imagine applying all possible hypergraph rewriting rules with signature 2-3 goes to 2-3 or something, where you've got two hyperedges of arity 3 going to two hyperedges of arity 3. And that gives you this thing called a rulio multi-way system. And we investigated this because it turns out that these rulio multi-way systems have a very, at least if you construct them in a certain way, have a very elegant, rich mathematical structure. They have the structure of what's called an infinity category or an infinity groupoid. And then there's a sort of classifying space of these rulio multi-way systems, which I think is really what the Rulliad is, although with a different name.
Yeah. That
has the structure of what's called an infinity 1 topos. And then the really cool thing about that, which was really Xerxes' idea, is that then there's a sort of very nice, elegant mathematical argument by which you can talk about how essentially spatial structure gets inherited down to these lower order multi-way systems from this infinity category structure by means of this thing called Grothendieck's hypothesis, which it's a very abstruse mathematical argument. I'm happy to talk about it if you're interested, but it's maybe not worth diverting the conversation in that direction just yet.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit beyond me, those kind of mathematical details, but it's one of these things that certainly grabs people's mind, the idea of a Rulliad and the idea of all possible rules, but how fruitful that will be in actually generating provable physics is another question.
Yeah, I mean, it's the point is, it's like, I think it's a lesson that one can learn from algorithmic complexity theory or algorithmic information theory, right? This idea that it's useful to talk about the complexity of a model or the complexity of a structure in terms of the minimum amount of information or the minimum size of algorithm that you would need to express it unambiguously. So the example that's often used in Kolmogorov complexity that illustrates how counterintuitive these things are is you ask someone, what's simpler, a single integer or the set of all integers? And, intuitively you go, well, obviously it's a single integer because it's way smaller than the set of all integers. But actually, the vast majority of integers are way more complicated than the set of all possible integers, because you can write down a simple algorithm or a simple rule or a simple mathematical expression or something that unambiguously defines the set of all possible integers. But a single integer could require an arbitrarily large amount of information to express. Yeah. And so from a Kolmogorov complexity standpoint or an algorithmic information complexity standpoint, most integers are more complicated than the set of all possible integers.
Yes.
So one place where I know this has been used is an argument in favor of the multiverse, right? That you say, well, you can make the same argument. What's simpler as an ontology? That just our universe exists, or that the space of all possible universes exist. And you can make the same argument to reason that it's more plausible that the space of all possible universes exists. So I kind of feel the same way about this kind of Rulliad idea, that it's like, well, yeah, okay, in some sense, just as the bottom-up view is very minimal, the Rulliad view is also very minimal, right? Because it requires basically almost no information to express unambiguously what it is. But precisely because of that, I think we believe that... Sorry, this is now getting very metaphysical, but we believe that there is some content to the universe. Or at least, I believe that there is some content to the universe, that it's not all just a tautology. That, to uniquely express our universe requires some non-trivial amount of information.
Yes.
And so, for that reason, I don't think either a pure bottom-up or a pure top-down approach are going to be enough, right? You need something that's you need that plus some other bit of data. You need either a rule that specifies how things get restricted or a rule that specifies how things get built up. I agree, it's a very good way of kind of capturing people's attention, thinking about all possible rules or all possible structures or all possible universes or something. But you have to impose on top of that something else in order to be able to get anything that's kind of non-trivial.
Why do you have that intuition? It's always very difficult to explain an intuition, but why do you have the intuition that the universe is not a tautology, that there is some information required to define our universe?
Okay, that's So I should be very clear. This is this is just me speculating about some bizarre, I can't prove any of this, right? But let me give two levels of explanation there. So the first thing is that I think if we look at what we know about the laws of physics, there are lots of things in there that are very kind of minimal and elegant, like the Einstein field equations, for instance.
Yeah,
you take essentially the simplest curvature invariant that you can define, and then you make the simplest constraint on that curvature invariant, and that gives you the Einstein field equations. And somehow remarkably, that's sufficient to encode all of gravity. It's amazing.
Yeah. So
there are certainly some things where it seems like the universe is very minimal and very structureless in that way. But then there are other places like, for instance, the particle content of the universe, where I think it's safe to say the same is not true. And, maybe someone will say, okay, but the fact that there's this hierarchy of particles and the fact that we have all these different fundamental forces is because of some broken symmetry or whatever. And that may end up being true. But it certainly seems to be the case that, and this is something which, actually I think theologians, people like John Duns Scotus and other scholastics first talked about this in a serious way, that the world seems to be neither completely trivial, right? It's neither fully reducible, where everything is ordered and minimal, but it's neither completely irreducible, right? It's not that everything is chaotic and we can't make any kind of general statements. It seems to lie somewhere in this liminal space in between, where there's enough content that it's interesting, but not so much content that we can't write down well-defined laws of science or laws of nature. And so I don't know. I suppose I, in terms of justification from my own metaphysical viewpoint, I defer to the scholastics.
Yeah.
That at least accords with my experience of reality.
Yeah.
That the universe is not completely trivial, but it's also not maximally complicated. Then I think another level of explanation which is worth bringing up at this point, because we haven't really discussed it yet, is the interplay between observers and the universe, right? So with any of these situations, there's a question of... There's an important philosophical question which I think doesn't get talked about in the philosophy of science enough, which is essentially the question of where you place the computational burden, right? Because one way that you can think about this dichotomy between the bottom-up picture and the top-down picture is that it's a distinction in whether you place the computational burden entirely on the universe or whether you place the computational burden entirely on the observer. What I mean by that is, in a bottom-up view, if you want to say, okay, we want some rule that generates, physics as we observe it, then basically what you're saying is the observer, you're not even caring about the observer. There's no model of the observer here. You just say, we have notions like particles and fields and curvature and whatever, and we want a rule that reproduces those phenomena. Okay, so the observer is irrelevant, and you're placing all of the computational burden on the universe to reproduce that phenomena. That's the kind of extreme bottom-up view. The other extreme is you say, well, actually, the universe is trivial, that it's just a Roolead or something, all possible structures are instantiated. And everything that we perceive, like curvature or fields or particle content, is some feature of us and the way that we perceive reality. It's some feature of how we slice apart the Roolead. And so then you're saying, well, now the computation for the universe is trivial, all the computational burden is being placed on the observer, and that's the kind of extreme top-down view. And so all of physics is a byproduct of how we perceive reality, not a byproduct of reality as it actually is, so to speak.
Yes.
And again, I don't think it's meaningful to say that one of these is true and one of these is false. It's that they're equivalent ways of viewing the same thing.
Yes.
All we really know are the things we can observe, and we can parameterize it however we like. And so, again, the best way I can summarize my own philosophical prejudice is that the most fruitful way of thinking about the nature of reality is to suppose that it's somewhere in between, that it's neither the case that the observer is completely unimportant and trivial, but it's also neither the case that the universe is completely unimportant and trivial. It's that both take some kind of share of the computational burden, and that therefore the laws of physics are partially a byproduct of reality as it really is, so to speak, whatever that means, and partially a byproduct of how we as observers make sense of the qualia that we experience. But precisely what that balance is, I don't claim to know that.
The introduction of the observer into this theory is fascinating because physics has had a slightly interesting relationship with the idea of an observer for a long time now. It's always seemed very dodgy the way that physics deals with the idea of an observer in quantum mechanics to collapse the wave function. Wolfram Physics actually promises to make the concept more precise in terms of the observer being what effectively imposes causal invariance and possibly reduces the multi-way graph to a single thread of time. So could you say a little bit more about that, how the observer plays that role in Wolfram Physics?
Yeah, absolutely. But actually, you skipped over, or you briefly mentioned something which I think is actually an extremely important and deep point, which is the role of the observer in kind of traditional science.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, to relate stuff to what we said at the beginning, or towards the beginning, about computational irreducibility, part of the underlying assumption of theoretical science has traditionally been that the observer is kind of infinitely computationally sophisticated relative to the system that they're observing, right? So, in a sense, when you choose to make a theoretical scientific model, you are sort of being sufficiently arrogant as to assume that your methods of analysis, your maths, your physical intuition, whatever it is capable of somehow shortcutting the computational process that the system you're trying to explain is actually doing. And of course, there are situations where you can do that, like, for instance, celestial mechanics or whatever. But there are also plenty of other situations where, as far as we can tell, you can't, like molecular dynamics.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it doesn't normally get couched in these terms, but I would argue, and again, this is me essentially parroting stuff that comes from NKS, that the two most fundamental theories of 20th century physics, general relativity and quantum mechanics, one way you can think about them is that they both emerge as a consequence of being more realistic about the nature of the observer and the limitations of the observer, what the observer can and can't do, right? So relativity, one way you can think about the foundation of relativity is it's basically saying, there are some things that observers can unambiguously know, like the causal structure of spacetime, but then there are some things that observers can't unambiguously know, like, for instance, the ordering of space-like separated events in their reference frame.
Yeah.
That's something which no two observers are guaranteed to be able to agree upon. And again, so that's very kind of anti the traditional scientific view of the observer, but somehow by being slightly more realistic about what the observer can and can't do, we immediately get this really foundational theory, which is general relativity. Similarly, quantum mechanics, one way that you can think about it, I don't necessarily think it's the most useful way to think about it, but one way you can think about it is that, things like the uncertainty principle are a consequence. I mean, this is the basis of Heisenberg's microscope experiment and the Heisenberg microscope thought experiment and things like that, where you basically say, well, the observer, you have an observer and you've got a system that they're observing, and traditionally we think of the observer as being kind of infinitely far removed from the system they're observing, that they they can perform a completely independent experiment that's kind of isolated from both themselves and from the rest of the universe. And in a sense, quantum mechanics is telling us that that isn't true, that the observer is bound by exactly the same physical restrictions, physical constraints as the system that they're observing. And in particular, in order to be able to make an observation of that system, they need to become entangled with it. And as soon as they become entangled with it, they become inseparable from it. And the state of them and their observations is really deeply related to the abstract state of the system and blah, blah, blah. And again, so, the formalism of quantum mechanics can again be thought of as a consequence of being more realistic about the nature of the observer. So, yeah, and then as you say, in a sense, the Wolfram Physics Project kind of takes that to, I would argue, its next logical step. And so this is the place where I mentioned at the beginning that sort of one of the things that led to essentially the start of this project was this realization I had about how you could do these explorations without the need to impose a priori causal invariance on the rules. And that was based on a realization. So, when I was reading NKS, it had always seemed kind of ugly to me that we have to impose, because causal invariance is quite a strong restriction.
Yeah.
It's certainly not a natural restriction to impose. It's a restriction that you would only really impose either if you wanted to make an efficiency saving, so you didn't have to tree out big multi-way systems, or if you were trying to kind of reproduce physics. But otherwise, it feels like a very arbitrary restriction. And I somehow never really, it never really gelled with me particularly. And similarly, the explanation in the book, Stephen's kind of conjectural explanation of quantum phenomena, where the idea is basically that you could have kind of long-range pieces of the hypergraph that connected apparently distinct regions of space in such a way that, that you have long-range edges that don't correspond to, the usual 3+1 dimensional spacetime structure, and that you could use that to kind of set up correlations that you'd need to reproduce quantum entanglement and violate Bell's inequalities and stuff. I don't know. It, again, seemed a little bit ad hoc. I didn't particularly like that as an explanation. So what I realized was that actually we could solve both of these problems by, again, just being slightly more realistic about the nature of the observer. So let's imagine that the evolution of the universe is not just a single thread of time. It's a multi-way system where you've got different branching and merging events happening. And the universe is not causal invariant, right, yet. There's no a priori causal invariance that's being imposed. Okay, so what is an observer? Again, normally we might think of an observer as being kind of localized to a single branch of the multi-way system. That would be sort of the traditional, many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics kind of view, right? That you are an observer in one universe in the space of possible universes.
Yeah.
But what I thought was useful was to say, well, okay, let's imagine that's not really true. I mean, because if the observer is going to be described by the same computational rules as the system itself, then it's not just that the universe is branching and merging, but the observer is branching and merging, right? Their internal perception of the world is branching and merging at the same time. So you quickly realize that it's not useful, it's not accurate to think of the observer as being localized to a single multi-way branch. Rather, the observer is an extended object in the multi-way system as a whole, and they're moving through the entire multi-way system. They're not just moving through a single branch. They're perceiving essentially all branches of history.
Okay.
So you might think, okay, well, such an observer couldn't possibly, such an observer would go insane, right? They couldn't possibly reach any definite conclusions about what was going on. They couldn't have a single persistent notion of time. They couldn't make any kind of consistent statements about reality. But then what I came to realize is, well, if you look at, these individual multi-way branches, at least locally, the differences in the structure of the hypergraph that separate two multi-way branches are quite small, right? They might be at the level of a single hypernode or a small collection of hypernodes or something. Certainly far, far below anything that you'd expect an observer, a big macroscopic observer, to be able to distinguish, right?
Yeah.
If I show you two pictures of the universe where I've, permuted a couple of hyperedges here or there, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between those two.
Yeah.
So what I realized is that a sufficiently macroscopic observer is effectively going to be coarse graining their description of the underlying hypergraph. They're not seeing the micro details of the hypergraph. They've got some coarse grained picture in terms of space-time and these continuous structures. So the observer is really imposing a coarse graining. And how do you actualize that coarse graining? Well, that coarse graining really just means that you're imposing a certain set of equivalences between different branches of the multi-way system. You're saying the hypergraphs on these branches of the multi-way system are distinct, but they differ at a level that's so small that to the observer, they are the same. So the observer is imposing some equivalences. And you can actualize those equivalences as what are called completion rules. So these are rules that effectively These are rules that are not part of the evolution of the universe. They're kind of fake rules that the observer is imposing that let them effectively jump from one branch of history to another. They're sort of two-way rules that enable them to jump between the two, that tangle the branches of history together.
Yeah.
Those rules are a way of formally encoding the statement that, to the observer, these branches of history are the same. They can't tell the difference. Well, what I was able to show was that if you add enough of these completion rules to the system, then you could take any arbitrary multi-way system and you could make it equivalent to one that was causal invariant. So in other words, that any arbitrary non-causal invariant multi-way system could be reduced to one that was observationally equivalent to a causal invariant one, so long as the observer performed a sufficient amount of coarse graining, as long as they added enough of these completion rules. So that had one very nice consequence, which is it meant that it allowed us to study multi-way systems without having to worry about whether they were causal invariant or not, because we knew that the observer could impose causal invariance post hoc, whatever happened. But the other really nice and somewhat unexpected feature is it turned out to give us quantum mechanics in the following way. So one of the reasons why quantum mechanics is considered to be sort of philosophically somewhat unpleasant and why it's still considered to be kind of an incomplete theory is because there's a distinction made between evolution and measurement. So evolution, which is how a quantum system evolves through time, is performed by applying these so-called unitary operators, these operators where if you take a conjugate transpose, whatever, you get the time reversal. But then measurement is this sort of mysterious and somewhat magical procedure that you do at the end, where you then take your pure quantum system that's been evolving according to the Schrödinger equation, it's just a pure kind of superposition of eigenstates, and then you apply not a unitary operator, but what's called a Hermitian operator, an operator with a different set of algebraic conditions that say now if you take a conjugate transpose, you don't get the time reversal, you just get the same thing back. And then that performs a measurement, and that collapses the wave function, and you recover a single eigenstate with some classical probability associated with it. And so somehow quantum mechanics has tended to make this distinction between the time evolution, the unitary evolution, and the measurement, the application of the Hermitian operator. Well, in the multi-way system, there's actually a very natural encoding of these things. So the application of the conjugate transpose operation, this adjoint operation, is effectively like just flipping the orientation of an evolution edge. So if you've got an evolution edge from A to B, you just flip it around so now it goes from B to A. So for the edges that evolve you down the multi-way system, if you apply this inversion operation, you get a time reversal. So they basically, algebraically, they act like unitary evolutions. These completion rules that the observer imposes that allow you to hop from one branch to another, they're symmetric, right? You can go from branch A to branch B and branch B to branch A. So if you apply the adjoint operation there, you get the same thing. And so they act effectively like Hermitian operators. And we were able to show, and this is in the series of papers that I wrote immediately prior to the launch of the physics project, I was able to prove that the algebra that you get out from considering these unidirectional edges that evolve you forwards in time and these bidirectional edges that map between the different branches of history, which are crucial for giving you this kind of observer-imposed causal invariance, their algebraic properties are the same as the algebraic properties of the unitary and Hermitian operators that you get in quantum mechanics. And so there's a well-defined sense in which you can say these completion rules that the observer adds to coarse grain out these different branches of history and make their causal structure equivalent. There's a well-defined sense in which you can say those completion rules are isomorphic to quantum measurements. And so that imposition of those coarse grainings or those completions becomes a kind of actualization of the process of quantum measurement. So not only does it reproduce the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics, but it also kind of gives you a physical explanation for why that measurement operation happens, why the wave function collapses. It's not that anything magical is happening. It's just that the apparent wave function collapse is a consequence of the macroscopic nature of the observer and the fact that the observer can't, you've got the superposition of these different branches of history, but because they differ on scales that are much smaller than the observer can macroscopically measure, the observer imposes an equivalence between them that treats them as being sort of the same, at least up to their causal structure. And that imposition of the equivalence that collapses the multi-way system down to just a single thread is the collapse of the wave function. And so this very pragmatic way of trying to avoid having to do systematic searches for causal invariance accidentally gave us a formulation of quantum mechanics.
That is fantastic. That's amazing. So just to be clear, that's always possible to take a system that's not causally invariant, and if you get at a high enough level of observation, you can always reduce it to a causally invariant system?
It's always possible with a very significant footnote. So one problem is when you add these completion rules, they enable you now to reach new states of the system that maybe you couldn't reach before.
Yeah.
So the observer can see effectively, in the observer's perception of the world, they can see multi-way states that maybe were not permitted in the original, pure formulation of the multi-way system before they imposed the completion. And that's okay. In fact, you can show that if you want to reproduce phenomena like, say, quantum interference, those kind of spurious observer-produced states are the essence of phenomena like quantum interference and quantum tunneling and so on. So it's important that they exist, but it comes with a rather negative side effect, which is if you want to collapse the multi-way system down to something that's purely causal invariant, then every time you get a branch that doesn't resolve, you need to add some completion rule that resolves that branch. But those completion rules can introduce new branches, right? Because they can introduce new states that weren't previously reachable. And so you can end up in the rather undesirable situation where each completion rule you add to resolve one branch creates two new branches.
Right.
And then that procedure won't ever terminate. So eventually it will terminate. It will eventually terminate once you essentially exhaust the complete rule multi-way system for that hypergraph signature, which is trivially causal invariant. So there's a sense in which, yes, okay, eventually if you keep on adding completion rules ad infinitum, you will get something causal invariant, which is why I say, yes, it's guaranteed, you can always do it.
Yeah.
You can't always do it in a finite number of steps. And in order to be kind of physically plausible, you need to be able to do it in a finite number of steps.
I wanted to ask you also about general relativity. So I've heard criticism of Wolfram physics from people who are concerned that there's not enough connection between these ideas and reality. I think a lot of these people just aren't aware of your work deriving quantum mechanics and general relativity from the hypergraph, which in my mind is just really compelling evidence that this project might at least have a chance of being on the right track. So could you go into your derivation of general relativity? Could you give us a high-level overview of how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've already actually touched on a major piece of it, right? So as we said before, there's a canonical way that for a given hypergraph or a given causal graph, you can try to work out its dimension. And that's by analogy to what you might call the Hausdorff dimension of a continuous space. So if you want to work out the Hausdorff dimension of a space, you grow out a ball or some higher dimensional ball, and you look at how does its volume scale as a function of its radius.
Yeah.
And so if it's a flat plane, it'll grow like r squared. If it's a three-dimensional space, it'll grow like r cubed. And in general, it'll grow like r to the d in a d-dimensional space. And so you can do an analogous thing. If you've got a hypergraph, you can look at an individual node, you can look at all the nodes adjacent to that node, all the nodes adjacent to those nodes, etc., and you can grow out some discrete ball of radius r, and then you look at how many nodes are contained inside that ball, and if you do a logarithmic difference estimation, you can work out the exponent of the growth rate, and from that you can derive an approximation to what would be the continuum dimension if it were a continuous space.
Yeah.
So there's a notion of dimension. There's also a notion of curvature, because, and this is based on some work from the differential geometer Alfred Gray. So in continuum geometries, if you've got now a curved space, and you do this construction, you grow out a small ball, what's called a geodesic ball of radius r, then so its leading order term is r to the d, but then there are subleading terms as well. And the first subleading term, which is proportional to r squared, so the dimension is contributing exponentially, this is contributing quadratically.
Yeah.
But the first subleading term turns out to be proportional to what's called the Ricci scalar curvature, which is something that appears in the Einstein equations. It's the simplest kind of curvature invariant, purely scalar quantity that you can define for an arbitrary surface.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, therefore, one way you can interpret the Ricci scalar geometrically is it's telling you effectively what is the if you look at the volume of a ball of radius r in your curved space, and you look at a ball of radius r in the corresponding flat space of the same dimension, the Ricci scalar is kind of telling you the discrepancy in the volumes of those two balls. It's giving you the subleading correction in this expansion for the dimension. And so you can apply the same construction, that same construction due to Alfred Gray, you can apply in the hypergraph case too. Just as you can get a discrete notion of dimension, you can also extract a discrete notion of Ricci curvature. And then there's a more sophisticated construction where instead of looking at just a ball, you can look at a geodesic tube, or in a causal graph, say a geodesic cone. So instead of just looking at the curvature at one point, you can look at 2 points. You can construct a geodesic tube of a certain radius but maps between them. And then again, in Gray's paper, there's both a paper, I think, from the 1970s, but there's also a book he wrote that's rather conveniently just called Tubes, which is all about the kind of Riemannian geometry of tubes and curvature invariance of tubes. And so the idea there is you can do an analogous construction. You can look at the expansion of the volume of that tube, And again, its leading order term will be dependent on the dimension of the space, and the subleading term is now dependent on the curvature, not the scalar curvature, but now because this is a directional quantity, it's a directional curvature, namely it's a projection of the Ricci curvature tensor, which is the directional analog of a curvature invariant, which is kind of the next simplest curvature invariant, and crucially, the Ricci curvature tensor and the Ricci scalar curvature are the two quantities that appear in the Einstein equations, right? The Einstein equations are telling you that some combination of the scalar curvature, the curvature tensor, and the metric tensor is equal to effectively the matter-energy distribution of spacetime, the stress-energy tensor. And so again, we can do exactly the same construction. We can get kind of these projections of the discrete Ricci curvature tensor. So from that, we should have all the pieces in place necessary to formulate essentially a discrete version of at least the vacuum Einstein field equations. So we can do that. We can work out what constraints that would correspond to. But then the interesting question is, are those constraints satisfied? And for what rules are those constraints satisfied?
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really quite beautiful, because it turns out those constraints are satisfied for a very general, and it turns out very natural class of hypergraph rewriting systems. So in particular, as long as your hypergraph rewriting systems satisfy three axioms, three constraints, namely causal invariance, what I call asymptotic dimension preservation, and something called weak ergodicity, which we touched on earlier, but which I'll explain again, which is related to computational irreducibility. As long as those three conditions are satisfied, the Einstein field equations drop out as an inevitable mathematical consequence.
Yeah.
So to explain why that's true, okay, so we know what causal invariance means, right? We know that's just invariance of the causal structure to the updating order of the hypergraph. Weak ergodicity, which is kind of the most abstract of the three, that's, as I say, the kind of the hypergraph analog of the molecular chaos assumption from molecular dynamics. And that you can encode mathematically as a very formal statement. It basically says if you take a causal graph, just as I said before, if you imagine like a box of molecules, one way you could encode weak ergodicity is you say if you place a surface in that box, wherever you place that surface, the flux of molecules through that surface the net flux should converge to zero. You can make the same statement. You can say in a causal graph, I set up an arbitrary hypersurface in the causal graph, then the net flux of causal edges through that hypersurface should converge to zero. And then the remaining condition, the second of the conditions I mentioned, which is asymptotic dimension preservation, this is just the statement that the overall dimension of the spacetime, as described by the causal graph, should converge to something fixed and finite, right? It shouldn't kind of diverge off to infinity.
Yeah.
Okay? So, as long as those three conditions are satisfied, you get the Einstein field equations. And this is why. So, okay, to really appreciate why this works, you kind of need to have some familiarity with the traditional way the Einstein field equations are derived, which is using what's called the Einstein-Hilbert action. So this is a way you can derive the Einstein field equations by means of a variational principle. You build this thing called the Einstein-Hilbert action, which is just an integral over the Ricci scalar curvature of spacetime. You define that action integral over the entirety of spacetime. And if you extremize that integral, if you say the variation of that integral has to be zero, and as long as you assume zero surface terms and blah, 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 under those assumptions, you get the vacuum Einstein field equations, right? So we call that Ricci scalar the relativistic Lagrangian density for gravitation. So that's where it comes from. And so it turns out that the condition of asymptotic dimension preservation is really a discrete analog of the Einstein-Hilbert action. So because, as I mentioned before, the Ricci scalar curvature and the projections of the Ricci curvature tensor appear as effectively the subleading contributions to the dimension computation. So let's imagine you're looking at the causal graph, and we want to make the statement that as we grow out the causal graph to infinity, that with each layer of the causal graph we add, we want it to be the case that the dimension is converging closer and closer to some fixed finite value.
Yeah.
In particular, we don't want it to be the case that it's diverging off to infinity. What would it mean for it to diverge off to infinity? Well, it would mean that for each new layer we add to the causal graph, in effect, the contribution of these subleading terms gets larger and larger.
Yeah.
Right? You can think of those as being like the kind of dimension anomaly. You've got the leading order term, which is the fixed dimension we assume it's converging to, and then you've got these subleading terms.
Yeah.
So, in particular, you don't want the contributions of these subleading terms to diverge off to infinity, because then the dimension will diverge off to infinity.
Yeah.
So, effectively, what you want to say is that if you average out the dimension anomaly across all the vertices in the causal graph, and across all possible projections of these cones, right? So across all possible projection directions of the discrete Ricci curvature tensor, that average, with each variation, with each additional layer of the causal graph, that average should converge to zero.
Yeah.
Or the contribution should converge to zero. And so what you should be left with once you've taken this infinite limit, is just the pure leading order dimension term that you started with.
Yeah.
Okay, so how would we go about encoding that? Well, if you take a projection in all possible directions of a rank 2 tensor, like the Ricci tensor, that's equivalent to what's called taking the trace. And in the context of differential geometry, that's the thing that from the Ricci tensor, if you take the trace across the two indices, you get the Ricci scalar. So taking all possible projection directions of the Ricci tensor gives you the Ricci scalar. Then you're taking the average of that Ricci scalar across all vertices in the causal graph. So you're averaging both across all projection directions and across all vertices. So effectively, you've got some discrete sum over the Ricci scalar for the entire causal graph. Then you're saying, okay, well, we want the variation of that. We want the increase of that with each new layer of the causal graph to converge to zero. So you're basically saying the variation of that discrete sum converges to zero. So that's the statement of asymptotic dimension preservation for the discrete case.
Yeah.
And implicitly there, by the way, we've used causal invariance because with each different projection direction we can choose at a given vertex, each one of those projection directions is like a different local choice of updating order. It's a different local gauge choice that we've made. And so the statement that we can do that and that the causal graph remains well defined, that we don't change the causal structure when we choose a different projection direction, is the statement of causal invariance. So we've implicitly used two of the assumptions. Now, finally, we can use the third assumption to say, well, let's imagine now we grow the causal graph to infinity. Well, with each new layer, it becomes a better and better approximation to some continuous spacetime. Well, the weak ergodicity hypothesis then allows us to exchange that sum, that discrete sum, for an integral in the continuum limit. That's what ergodicity allows you to do. It's a sort of analytic assumption that we need in order to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So now our statement of asymptotic dimension preservation becomes a statement that the variation of an integral over the Ricci scalar, defined over the entire causal graph, should converge to zero. But that's exactly the statement that the Einstein-Hilbert action is extremized.
Yeah.
So the combination of those three assumptions gives you the vacuum Einstein field equations basically for free. Then there's a slightly more involved version of the same argument that gives you the non-vacuum field equations, where, okay, this requires yet another layer of formalism, but basically you treat contributions to the energy momentum tensor, the kind of baryonic matter contributions, you treat as being these localized topological obstructions in the hypergraph, which we may talk about later.
Yeah.
Those are effectively like contributions to the energy momentum tensor. But those localized topological obstructions effectively act like local increases in dimension, because compared to the background hypergraph, they are more than averagely densely connected, if that makes sense. So if you try and measure the dimension locally in the region of one of those topological obstructions, the dimension will appear to be locally higher than it was in the surrounding hypergraph, because it's more densely connected.
Yeah.
And so if you run through the same argument that I described for the vacuum case, but you still want the dimension to be finite, well now, in your computation, you need to account for the density of these localized topological obstructions in order to make sure that your dimension calculation isn't being thrown off by these apparent local increases in dimension. So effectively, in your discrete relativistic Lagrangian density, you don't just have the Ricci scalar anymore, you also have some contribution that's proportional to a projection of the energy momentum tensor, that's proportional to some quantity that depends on the mass energy content of the hypergraph.
Yeah.
And so then you get, subject to some assumptions about equations of state and so on, then you get the non-vacuum, the full form of the Einstein-Hilbert action, and that gives you the non-vacuum Einstein field equations, including the stress energy term. So it turns out that the Einstein field equations, the equations of general relativity, are a very, very generic consistency condition that you get for causal invariant, manifold-like hypergraphs that are not infinite dimensional.
That is fantastic. It must have been quite something when you realised, oh wow, the Einstein field equations can actually drop out of this. What did that feel like when you realised that?
It was wonderful. I mean, it was... Again, it's not entirely surprising because, as I mentioned in relation to that more metaphysical question before, the Einstein field equations are not super contrived. At least the vacuum field equations are, if you like, they're the simplest constraints that you could imagine imposing on a Riemannian structure. And we already knew kind of that hypergraphs more or less behave like Riemannian manifolds, at least some class of them do in some appropriate limit. And so it wasn't overly surprising that there should be some fairly limited set of restrictions you can make that would give you the Einstein field equations.
Yeah.
And effectively, my methodology was to kind of work backwards. It was to say, well, we know sort of what the discrete version of the Einstein-Hilbert action would look like. What kind of condition would that translate to on the hypergraphs? Oh, look, it turns out it's actually just the restriction that the dimension is not diverging off to infinity. And then, okay, to really make that analytically rigorous, you need to impose causal invariance and weak ergodicity. But really the heart of it is, as long as the hypergraph is growing in such a way that the dimension is not growing without bound, as long as that is the case, and as long as a continuum limit exists and is well defined, then the Einstein field equations are kind of an inevitable consequence of that. So it was really nice, but in a way it was, my own personal feeling was less, I mean, I know Stephen was very excited about this.
Yes.
But my own feeling was less one of excitement and more one of relief, right? Because for me it was like, well, because the Einstein equations are such a natural set of constraints to impose.
Yeah.
If it turned out that they corresponded to an extremely unnatural set of restrictions on Wolfram model rules, that would have been, for me, a very, very bad sign for the plausibility of the model.
Yes.
So it was more a relief that, like, a priori, one would hope that if this is a plausible model, then the set of restrictions should be fairly natural and limited. And they were fairly natural and limited. So it was more like, oh, yeah, okay, fine. Things worked out as they should do. Whereas if it had gone differently, I would have been much more concerned. So yeah, it was definitely a feeling of, yeah, my overwhelming emotion was relief rather than elation.
It's funny. I find this extremely compelling. It's not a way to prove that the hypergraph model is the way to go, but it's an absolute minimum. I mean, hypergraphs have got to be able to generate relativity, otherwise they don't model our universe, and so they're not a promising way forward for physics. But the fact that they are is still, in my mind, extremely compelling, and I find it hard to communicate this to people, perhaps because it's a little bit technical, a little bit mathematical. It's hard to communicate to people what a significant result this is.
Well, it's an interesting question, actually, how significant a result it is, because it's, and again, maybe this is probably related to the whole bottom-up, top-down dichotomy we were talking about earlier, but the fact that the Einstein equations are such a natural feature in these models, you can interpret, I think, in one of at least two ways. One thing you could do is say, well, therefore, these models are definitely capturing some really fundamental feature of reality, which I think is the view that Stephen takes.
Right.
I'm not so dogmatic, but it's possible. The other position, which is maybe more aligned with how I think, is that it's really telling us that actually general relativity is not very special, if you like.
Yeah.
It's a question which 10 years ago or something, one would have said definitely belonged squarely within the domain of philosophy. This question of how special are the laws of physics? If you imagine the space of all possible mathematically consistent or computationally consistent universes, are laws like general relativity or quantum mechanics or quantum field theory or particle physics, are these theories very peculiar to our physical universe, or are they somehow generic to a very large collection of possible universes?
Yeah.
That might have been an interesting question to kind of speculate about metaphysically, but it certainly didn't seem like a well-defined scientific question. Now, we actually have, I think, a well-defined scientific apparatus to address those questions. So in a sense, the conclusion is that at least if you parameterize the space of possible universes as the space of possible hypergraph rewriting rules, what you learn is that actually general relativity is extremely generic.
Yeah.
You might naively have hoped that the condition that our universe obeys GR might be enough to nail down maybe not exactly what the universe is, but maybe a small collection of them. But it's not, right? There are huge numbers of them that all satisfy the Einstein equations. Another conclusion that you can draw from that, and a conclusion you can draw from similar discoveries we've made about the genericity of quantum mechanics, is that maybe the most fundamental theories of physics we have are actually not that peculiar to our universe. They are somehow very generic features of a large collection of these models.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. I've heard you talk about the possibility that elementary particles might be non-planar tangles in the graph. So I like this idea of persistent perturbations that propagate through the hypergraph. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, how the hypergraph might give rise to elementary particles?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me be completely upfront about this. Of the parts of the model that are less developed, this is definitely one of them, right? So the stuff we've done on general relativity, quantum mechanics, that kind of stuff, there are big open questions, but I'd say that's comparatively well developed. Understanding of particle content, matter content, that's still pretty embryonic.
Yeah.
So we have some ideas about how that would work, and as you say, these ideas about persistent topological obstructions, of which these non-planar tangles are a good kind of at least toy model.
Yeah.
That's the leading idea we have right now, but I would love to be able to point at some piece of hypergraph and say, that's definitely an electron or something.
Exactly,
but I think we're a few steps away from being able to do something like that.
Indeed.
But yeah, okay, so the basic idea is So I think planarity is a useful, well, I don't think our actual universe is a two-dimensional planar graph. So planarity is almost certainly not the real model for particles, or non-planarity is not a real model for particles. But it's a good toy example that illustrates some of the core features of what we're talking about.
And by planarity, just to be clear, you just mean that the graph can be laid out as a flat plane.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so it's worth, particularly for those of your audience who have not encountered too much graph theory, I mean, it's worth defining some of these terms. So if you've got a network or a graph, planarity, exactly as Mark said, is the property that you can embed it in a two-dimensional plane without the edges crossing, right? So there are many graphs which you can do that with, but the famous one, because it relates to this famous riddle, is the utility graph, this bipartite complete graph on 3x3 vertices. It's this famous problem where you've got three utilities like electricity, water, gas or something, and you've got three houses, and you want to connect every utility to every house in such a way that the pipes don't cross for some reason. And you can't do it. And the reason is because that graph, the bipartite complete graph on 3x3 vertices, is non-planar. There's no way to embed it in the plane without the edges crossing over. And it turns out there's a collection of theorems, specifically Kuratowski's theorem and Wagner's theorem in graph theory, that say that if you have a non-planar graph, that in a very precise sense, that non-planarity can be reduced to a certain number of instances of one of two kind of canonically non-planar graphs. What's called K5, the complete graph on 5 vertices, where every vertex is connected to every other vertex, and K33, the utility graph that we just described. So Kuratowski's theorem states that every non-planar graph must have a subgraph that is a subdivision of either K5 or K33. So basically, I mean, let's not get bogged down in the details of precisely what that means, but basically all it's saying is that somehow non-planarity you can always ascribe to the presence of one or more instances of either K5 or K33 in your graph. So, what that means is, imagine you defined a rewriting rule that preserved planarity, so that the left-hand side and the right-hand side were both planar. So in other words, that the graph after applying the rule is planar if and only if the graph was planar before you applied the rule.
Yeah.
So you might define this as a planarity preserving rule.
Yeah.
So if that's true, now let's imagine you've got a little non-planar tangle. You've got a little K5 or a little K33 like knocking about in that graph. Because the rule is planarity preserving, the rule is not going to create or destroy those tangles. They're just going to kind of propagate around as these persistent obstructions, these persistent localized disturbances. The only way that they might conceivably get eliminated is if they have some kind of collision event, they mutually annihilate or something. You can do this. You can set up these planarity preserving rewrite rules and look at how these little non-planar tangles kind of move about and interact, and you can construct things that look a lot like Feynman diagrams, where you have two non-planar pieces that come in, they have some period of interaction, and then two or more non-planar pieces come out. And so they have essentially a kind of whole particle physics of how they move around and how they interact, and which interactions between different non-planar pieces can give rise to what other non-planar pieces, and so on. And you can build a kind of taxonomy of these Feynman diagrams. And as I say, it looks intuitively a lot like particle physics.
Yeah.
And so one is therefore very tempted to conclude, well, maybe it doesn't just look like particle physics. Maybe this is the essence of particle physics, right?
Yeah.
So as I say, clearly for our universe, something like non-planarity is not going to be the answer.
Yeah.
But there is a generalization of these ideas like Kuratowski's theorem and Wagner's theorem called the Seymour-Robertson theorem. Probably the best way I can explain it is that those subgraphs, K5 and K33, for the case of planarity, in the context of Wagner's theorem, they're called forbidden minors. So a graph minor, taking a graph minor is where you take some graph and then you delete vertices or edges in a particular way. That corresponds to the operation of taking minors. So K5 and K33 are called forbidden minors because if your graph is planar, they are minors that cannot be derived from the graph you started from. In other words, if either of those appears as a minor of your graph, you know that the graph you started from couldn't have been planar.
Yeah.
So this is called a forbidden minor characterization. And the Seymour-Robertson theorem tells you that there is basically an infinite class of different kinds of graphs that permit these forbidden minor characterizations. So planar graphs are just one special case of the Seymour-Robertson theorem, but there are many, many others. And some of these have much less restrictive constraints than just, graph planarity. Seymour-Robertson is interesting for a lot of reasons, but one is that it's essentially like a sort of combinatorial analog of a topological theorem, that it's treating the forbidden minors as like topological obstructions in a graph. So what you get from the Seymour-Robertson theorem is effectively, for a given class of graphs, it gives you essentially like a collection, it basically gives you particle content, right? Yes. It says, if you have a rule that preserves this property of your graph, then these are the localized topological obstructions that will be preserved by that rule, and therefore these are your candidate elementary particles.
Yeah.
So from this really unexpected source of this very abstract theorem of combinatorics, we basically get a statement of like, what particle content could we expect for a rule that satisfies a given set of constraints? That's what you get from this forbidden minor characterization. And so that's our current best guess for how elementary particles will work. That there's some property of the hypergraph that gets preserved by the rules, and violations of that property or forbidden minors under that property correspond to the particle content because they are then the things that will behave like these localized topological obstructions.
Obviously, there's just a huge distance between those kind of toy models and elementary particles in reality, not least because of size. I mean, if the nodes and edges of the graph are at a scale of, 10 to the minus 100 meters, say, tiny, tiny, tiny scale, elementary particles are on a much larger scale than that. So are we likely to run into the problem that it's just going to be impossible ever to simulate such large particles on any computer we could possibly imagine?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the honest answer is I don't know. I have no real intuition for that because, so the number you quoted about elementary edges potentially being sort of 10 to the minus 100 meters or, that kind of order of magnitude of scale. In ordinary physics, people tend to think of elementary particles as being like the smallest thing you could imagine. And now we're talking about many, many orders of magnitude smaller than that, many orders of magnitude below the Planck scale.
Yeah.
That is an estimate from 2019.
Okay.
That we came up with it's fair to say, in a big hurry as part of Stephen's technical introduction. It's an estimate that's based on a very, very rickety set of estimates.
Yeah.
It's like we built this kind of big tower of maybe 20 estimates, each one of which is somehow inherently questionable. And at the top of this tower, we were able to construct this estimate of the elementary length. I mean, so for instance, that was based on an assumption about, we were trying to kind of consider like maximal lengths in terms of Hubble scales, and then try and from those maximal lengths infer like what the minimum energy content might be.
Yeah.
We had to make a whole big collection of assumptions. It's a very rickety estimate.
Yeah.
That involved a lot of slightly dodgy dimensional analysis and whatever.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is I'm certainly not sure that I completely believe that estimate. I don't think Stephen completely believes it either. It's a possibility. I mean, it's certainly... Let me put it this way. Conventionally, when discrete models of spacetime have been proposed, it's generally been assumed that they must operate at the Planck scale. But in a sense, the Planck scale is just the upper limit of that length scale, right? The Planck scale is the place where we know we need something different. It's the place where we know our traditional methods of GR and QM are going to break down. The transition from the discrete model to the continuum approximation must have happened by at least the Planck scale. But it could be that the actual discretization scale is many, many orders of magnitude below. There's certainly space for that to be true. But we don't really know whether it's true or not, I would say. All of which is to say that I don't have a good formal intuition for what kind of scales we'd expect elementary particles to be. They could be the order of 10 nodes. They could be at the order of 10 to the 100 nodes. I don't really have a good sense of on which side it's going to be. And you're completely right that if it is 10 to the 100 nodes, then we have absolutely no hope of ever being able to explicitly simulate, an electron or something, which would be a shame. But again, I think the saving grace is that, going back to the analogy of fluid mechanics and relativity and things, that most of the recognizable physics that we've been able to find in the model so far has the feature that it's not about the microscopic details, it's some kind of coarse-grained approximation to what's microscopically going on, and the physical statements we're making are statements about the coarse grainings, they're not statements about the microstructure. And so one possibility, which I consider to be quite plausible, is that things like quantum field theory that tell us essentially about the dynamics of elementary particle interactions, that those equations won't care that much about the microstructure details of what an electron looks like. Because I suspect that the kind of scattering amplitudes and the S matrices and the propagators and so on that you get in your QFT are really very coarse-grained statements about the bulk structure of particles that are going to be basically agnostic as to, is this hyperedge over here or is it over there in this kind of big bundle of hyperedges? So even if it turns out to be the case that, something like an electron is way too big for us to be able to simulate directly, which would be a shame, but we have to be open to that as a possibility. But even if that's the case, I'm still reasonably optimistic that we'll at least be able to make connection with the conventional mathematical formalism of particle physics, because I suspect that the conventional formalism, because it tends to talk about things like scattering amplitudes, which are really kind of very coarse-grained bulk properties of quantum fields, that we'll be able to make those statements even if we can't explicitly simulate the microstructure of the elementary particles themselves.
There are people those same people who are concerned about the connection between Wolfram physics and reality, they often ask, okay, so what are the verifiable predictions you get from this theory? In my mind, it's going to be hard to get there because, first of all, the theories we have, general relativity and quantum mechanics, are extremely precise. They work amazingly in terms of predicting what we see in the universe. And because of this problem where the hypergraph is at such a small scale and so much smaller than the Planck scale potentially, or at least, like you say, at an upper bound, it's at the Planck scale, but it could be much, much smaller than that. So we're never going to see nodes and edges directly. We and our instruments are made of nodes and edges, and so it's sort of very difficult to imagine how we could possibly see nodes and edges directly. But I have heard you talk about certain possibilities, things like, small discrepancies in the dimensionality of space from perfectly three-dimensional is one of them that might give us verifiable predictions. What are your thoughts on how we might find evidence for Wolfram physics?
Yeah, a few comments that are worth making on that. So one is, I think, what philosophers call a category error. And this is actually something which I slightly... It was a disagreement that I had in sort of how the project was marketed, so to speak, right? This description of it as like a project to find the fundamental theory of physics, or even worse, sometimes described as a fundamental theory of physics.
Yes.
Where really what it is a formalism, right?
Yeah.
The Wolfram model is not a theory. It's a formalism that parameterizes an infinite class of theories. And those theories have some commonality. One of the interesting features of it is that certain things that we might think of as being peculiar features of our physical universe, like relativity and quantum mechanics, turn out to be fairly generic features of a large class of those models. But still, asking for verifiable predictions of the Wolfram model as a whole is kind of like asking for verifiable predictions of like calculus or differential geometry.
Yes,
it's
indeed.
It's a language for formalizing theories. It's not a theory in its own right.
Yeah.
That's the first comment I'd make. But then, okay, so now that disclaimer is out of the way, yeah, okay, you might hope that there's enough genericity in things like the Einstein equations and whatever emerging in these models that you may be able to make, even at the level of the formalism, you might be able to make quite generic statements about testable predictions. There I have some... I don't know. I think, okay, it's a fairly generic feature of these Wolfram model systems that they do not have perfectly homogeneous dimension, either in space or in time.
Yeah.
One fairly generic feature that the models also have is that many of them start off very densely connected and effectively kind of cool down. They become more sparsely connected over time. And that effectively translates to they start off essentially infinite dimensional and then they gradually converge to something that's three-dimensional. And that's immediately quite interesting because what that's telling you is that effectively the universe is starting off much more causally connected than you would expect it to be if you assumed it was three-dimensional. And the reason why that's significant is because that potentially offers, for instance, an alternative to what's called inflation in standard cosmology, right? So in Big Bang cosmology and what's called lambda CDM cosmology, there are these major problems, the horizon problem, the flatness problem, the magnetic monopole problem, etc., that can really all be boiled down to the fact that our universe appears to have been in causal contact much sooner than it should have been, so to speak, right? So when we look at the cosmic microwave background, the reason why inflation was originally proposed was because when you look at the CMB, you see that it's a very, very homogeneous distribution of radiation, right? The temperature is very homogeneous in space. There are small fluctuations here and there, which is very important because we believe those are the seeds of galaxies and all large-scale structure. But by and large, within like a couple of percent, it's all about whatever it is, 2.7 Kelvin, kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
Why is that, right? If you just take the standard hot Big Bang model, the standard lambda CDM model, there wasn't time. If you look at the kind of past light cones of every point in space, there wasn't time for those points to have entered thermal equilibrium. They weren't in causal contact for long enough. So in the standard model of cosmology, they should not be in thermal equilibrium, and yet they are.
Yeah.
And so the solution that was proposed by Alan Guth and André Linde and so on was that you've got this inflationary period of expansion where the universe expanded much, much more rapidly than we initially thought. That has the effect of essentially smoothing out the initial inhomogeneities that we expect to see as a consequence of quantum fluctuations, so that there is a gradient, but you're seeing a much, much shallower gradient than you would have expected in the standard Big Bang model because it's been inflated.
Yeah.
So this is an approach that's been proposed. It does, the advantage of inflation is it does explain the horizon flatness, monopole problems, etc. But the disadvantage is that we have no idea what the particle physics of inflation is, really.
Yeah.
It relies on this hypothetical inflaton scalar field whose particle physics is essentially unknown. There are these quintessent scalar field models that have been proposed that couple to things like the Higgs mechanism or to dark energy in some slightly complicated way. They're probably the most plausible particle physics mechanisms that are currently being explored, but still, it's basically a mystery. So it's a bit of a non-explanation. It solves one problem, but it brings up a million more.
Yeah.
The exciting thing about this kind of dimension cooling possibility is that it potentially gives one a way to explain away the horizon and flatness problems without the need to postulate inflation, right? Because essentially, if the universe starts off essentially infinite dimensional, then points in space can be in causal contact much, much sooner. The apparent conflict with the horizon problem emerges from the potentially sort of mistaken assumption that the universe has always been three-dimensional. If you relax that assumption and you say maybe earlier on, closer towards the initial singularity, it was much higher dimensional, then points of space can enter causal contact much, much more quickly. They can enter thermal equilibrium much more quickly, and you can reproduce the observations that you see in the CMB without the need to postulate an inflaton, without the need really to postulate any new physics, just this kind of gradual cooling of the dimension. So if that's really true, which we don't know, but it's a fun thing to think about, if that's really true, then one would expect that although you would see almost perfect accord with the predictions of inflation, because the conformal structure of the spacetime you get is pretty much identical to that of inflation, there would be some small discrepancies. So in things like the cosmic neutrino background, or in details of the decoupling time of the cosmic microwave background, we haven't done the work of actually doing all of the kind of theoretical cosmology yet, but it's become pretty clear just from the initial kind of back-of-the-envelope calculations that you can do, that, for instance, you would expect the recombination time and the decoupling times to be sooner, to be earlier, in a model which is based on global dimension change than you would in a model that's based on inflation. And that has consequences for things like, the temperature of dark energy and things like that.
Yeah.
So that's one possibility, these kind of cosmological consequences of global dimension change. Another possibility is essentially astrophysical consequences of local dimension change. So in addition to the dimension changing globally, you could also imagine having kind of local small-scale dimension perturbations that propagate a bit like gravitational waves. And again, those seem to be very generic features of the model, that it's almost never the case that you get a Wolfram model rule where the hypergraph is exactly three-dimensional everywhere. There are normally at least little pockets where it's like 3.01 dimensional somewhere and 2.99 dimensional somewhere else. And those little perturbations will kind of propagate like nonlinear gravitational waves. And those will in turn have kind of lensing effects, just like gravitational waves do. But their lensing effects will be different to gravitational waves precisely because of the thing I was saying earlier about the exponential versus quadratic contribution to the volume. So effectively, if you have a dimension perturbation and you compare that to a curvature perturbation, the dimension perturbation will distort your light rays much more extremely than a curvature perturbation, because effectively one is contributing exponentially, the other is contributing only quadratically to the distortion of the metric. So this means that you do have a bit of trouble, in principle, distinguishing a very large curvature perturbation from a comparatively small dimension perturbation. But at least in principle, there are ways that you could try and, you see some perturbation in the structure of space-time, and there are at least heuristic ways that you could try and work out, is this a curvature perturbation or is it a dimension perturbation?
Yeah.
Again, there's more I can say about that, but that's another possibility. Yet another thing is there are extreme astrophysical events which in principle might kind of lay bare the discrete structure of the space-time. So one example of this is in black hole inspirals. This is obviously a very trendy topic in astronomy right now because of LIGO and gravitational wave observatories and things. But so when you've got very, very strong relativistic field dynamics, then in effect, because you've got very, very high curvatures, as the curvature gets higher and higher, essentially you've got your causal edge density or your hypergraph density becomes progressively lower and lower, right? In a sense, it's like you've got causal edges that are getting more and more stretched across space until eventually, very, very close to, say, a black hole merge, when you've got kind of the maximally strong relativistic field dynamics. You actually expect that to be very, very low causal edge density, perhaps so low that discretization effects become significant. And one possibility there is that and this relates to some work I did last year on doing numerical simulations of things like black hole inspirals in the context of the Wolfram model. One thing you quickly discover is if you extract the so-called Weyl curvature to extract out essentially the quadrupole moment that you get from the gravitational wave perturbation, then depending on the precise mass scales of the black holes, you see some small-scale deviations from the expected quadrupole moment that you get from continuum general relativity. And those deviations are essentially discretization effects that occur as a consequence of the causal edge density going way down when you have very strong relativistic field effects. And so another possibility is that as our gravitational wave observatories get more accurate, we may be able to start seeing those small corrections that are really discretization errors in the gravitational wave signatures of violent astrophysical events like black hole spirals. That's another kind of rather exciting possibility.
Yeah.
Then there are kind of more speculative things like, for instance, I've mostly been talking about relativistic, astrophysical, cosmological predictions. There are also kind of more quantum mechanical ones, like, for instance, one thing that the model predicts that's a little bit different from conventional quantum mechanics is that it implies that there's a maximum speed with which microstates in a quantum system or subsystems of a quantum system can become entangled. So ordinarily in quantum mechanics, there's not really any limit to how quickly two different subsystems can become entangled. But because in the Wolfram model, we have a much more geometrical way of visualizing quantum mechanics, where the tensor product structure of our Hilbert spaces, and therefore the entanglement structure, is visualized concretely in terms of these branchial graphs. Well, those branchial graphs have a metric, and that metric means that there's a maximum speed with which two states can become tensor producted together and therefore can become entangled. That speed is extremely high. You're not going to encounter it in kind of everyday events. But again, at least in principle, there are laboratory experiments you could do to try and measure maximum entanglement speeds. So there are known bounds in existing quantum information theory, like the Margolis-Levitin bound, that give you some restrictions on how quickly subsystems of a quantum system can become correlated. In effect, the Wolfram model formulation gives us a new set of bounds that could also in principle be testable. That's a slightly more speculative idea, but it's at least another possible direction for inroads for phenomenological predictions. So yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic that there will be enough features of the model that are generic that we may be able to make phenomenological predictions sooner rather than later. But I mean, one problem, which is a sociological problem, is that we haven't, if we look at the people who've contributed most to the foundational development of the Wolfram model, Stephen was a first-class phenomenological particle physicist in the 1970s. Yeah. But it's not really what he does anymore. I'm very much not, I have no real training in physics. I'm a mathematician. We have some people like Xerxes and so on who are theoretical physicists, but again, have kind of really worked more on the mathematical side. So part of it is, part of the reason why we haven't made as much progress with the phenomenological and experimental prediction stuff is just a personnel issue, right? It's that we have, we're pretty well represented for computer scientists and mathematicians, and theoretical, and more mathematical physicists. We're pretty underrepresented for phenomenological theoretical physicists. And what we need is someone who's It used to be said of Abdus Salam that he was one of the last people who could really interact with both worlds. Who understood the mathematics but also understood the experiments and was able to translate between them. And what we need is, the mantra that I have in my head is that what we need the Abdus Salam of the Wolfram Physics Project, and we don't really have that person yet.
I wanted to ask you about your new centre. So this is the Centre for Applied Compositionality, which explores the interface between mathematics, computation, and the foundations of science. Could you tell me about that, and could you explain what you mean by compositionality?
Absolutely. And so this is a very direct outgrowth of the Wolfram Physics Project. Let's step back for a minute. What is it that we really learn from the Wolfram Physics Project? The fact that we can explain things like GR and QM and so on just using these kind of combinatorial structures. What do we really learn from that? Well, one conclusion that I kind of resoundingly started coming to at the end of 2020, and that's really formed over the last year and a half or so, is that effectively the most fundamental theories of physics we have are really theories about processes, right? They're theories about processes and how they compose. So I think the core lesson we learn from thinking about causal graphs is that the essence of general relativity is that you can compose events in sequence and you can compose events in parallel, but there are restrictions. You can only compose events in parallel if they're space-like separated, right? You can't compose events in parallel if they're time-like or light-like separated. And similarly, what is the essence of quantum mechanics? Well, in a sense, I think what we learned from thinking about things in terms of multi-way systems is that the essence of quantum mechanics is how you compose processes in parallel, right? So when you've got classical physics, if you've got phase spaces of two particles described by classical equations of motion, and you want to compose them together, so you get a composite system, and you want to describe the phase space of the composite system, well, that's easy to do. You just take the Cartesian product of the phase spaces you started from. So you just pair off essentially all the possible combinations of position and momentum values of the two particles. And that encodes the fact that composition, parallel composition, in classical physics is separable. You can always trace out the state of one particle and recover the state of the other. You don't lose any information. But in quantum mechanics, you can't do that, because if you compose two particles described by the Schrödinger equation together, and they're entangled, well, now there isn't a well-defined state of either particle in isolation. You've just got the state of the composite system. And that's a statement that the tensor product operation, the operation by which you compose the Hilbert spaces, is not Cartesian. It's actually closer to what you might characterize as a Kronecker product, kind of a maximally entangled quantum tensor product. Quantum mechanics is all about, I think, this kind of the liminal space between the purely classical Cartesian tensor product and the maximally quantum Kronecker tensor product and everything that's kind of in between. And so what one realizes, and this is really, the essence of multi-way systems, right, is that there's an algebra for processes and how they compose not just in sequence, which is what traditional computation is about, but in parallel, which is what multi-computation is about. And a huge amount of stuff, including, as I say, I think basically all of GR and all of QM can be encoded somehow in this algebra for how processes compose in sequence and in parallel. And compositionality is this idea that was really shamelessly stolen from Rudolf Carnap and the Vienna Circle and theoretical linguistics of the early 20th century. So in linguistics, compositionality is the idea that if you want to know the semantics of a sentence, right, then you can derive the semantics of a sentence if you just know the semantics of the individual pieces that make it up, the individual morphemes that carry semantic meaning, and the grammar for how those morphemes compose together. And so compositionality in the category theoretic sense is just taking that idea and applying it to essentially everything, right?
Yeah.
In applied category theory, there's this dogma of stuff and structure. You take any system, you decompose it into stuff, which is kind of the individual semantic pieces of which it's built up, and structure, kind of the rules for how those pieces thread together. And everything you could care to know about the system, or the process, or whatever, can be reconstructed from a combination of the stuff and the structure.
Yeah.
So in applied category theory, there's a very concrete way of talking about this, which is, well, I say very concrete, it's actually very abstract, but it's very, very precise, very well defined, in terms of these things called symmetric monoidal categories. Symmetric monoidal categories are really just a language for describing how processes compose in sequence and in parallel, how systems compose together in sequence and in parallel. And both quantum mechanics and relativity can be formulated in terms of these symmetric monoidal categories, or possibly partial symmetric monoidal categories. And what I came to realize is that multi-way systems, as studied in the Wolfram Physics Project, give you essentially a kind of very concrete computational semantics for these symmetric monoidal categories. So it's like you've got these two extremes. You've got the very, very concrete computational world of the Wolfram Physics Project and multi-way systems and causal graphs and so on. And then you've got the very abstract world that comes from category theory that describes as essentially an algebraic structure how notions like causality or processes, etc., compose together. But they're really describing the same thing. And so the Applied Compositionality Center, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take this fundamental kind of philosophical principle that, as I say, has its origins in linguistics but also from applied category theory, but really I think was really given teeth by the Wolfram Physics Project. The idea that if you just know the individual constituent components and you know the rules for how they compose together, then you know everything there is to know about the system. We're taking that kind of idea and these two methodologies, one very abstract coming from mathematics, the other very concrete coming from the Wolfram Physics Project, and we're trying to apply it to as wide a class of things as we can. So not just fundamental physics, but also things like biological ecosystems, chemical reaction networks, the structure of mathematical proofs. We're even trying to address some fairly general, almost philosophical questions about the nature of causality, right? What does causality really mean? There are at least 20 notions of causality that have appeared in the context of distributed systems, in physics, in the context of indefinite causal orders, in the context of trying to maintain concurrency. There are notions of causality that come from biology, etc. What do they really have in common? Is there some abstract, essential theory of causality that we can construct? So those are the kinds of questions that we're really trying to answer.
That's fascinating. It's amazing what a wide range of different disciplines these ideas can be applied to. Why do you think that is? Is it just that, I don't know, a hypergraph is basically just connections between nodes, and that's a very simple idea, and so of course you're going to see that throughout science, throughout the universe, or is there something more about these ideas that give them such wide application?
I don't know if there's something more. I would be tempted to conjecture that it is merely that when you've got one could make the same statement about mathematics, right? We discovered that starting with physics, but progressively it's been applied to more and more disciplines, we've discovered that formulating things in terms of mathematics, particularly in terms of partial differential equations, allows us to make a lot of progress in a bunch of different areas in physics, in chemistry, in engineering, etc. Why is that, right? You could ask the same question. And I think the reason is just that the axioms for traditional continuous mathematics, so to speak, they're not hugely elegant, but they're reasonably minimal. And we know that they're capable of computational universality, right? The axioms of something like ZFC set theory are capable of simulating a universal Turing machine. And therefore, if we assume that our universe is a universal Turing machine and that things in the universe can be modeled as universal Turing machines, then it's kind of unsurprising that we can configure the axioms of mathematics to simulate our universe.
Yeah.
And then the only remarkable thing about it is that, in a sense, the encoding function, the function that lets us map the abstract mathematical or computational states of our model to concrete physical states of our system and lets us say, yes, that feature of our model, that really corresponds to this particular particle or this particular animal or something. The fact that that encoding function is quite minimal, that is quite surprising. And I don't have a good explanation for that. But in a sense, I think that my slightly circular answer would be, that's what it means for a model to be good, right? A good model is precisely one where the encoding function that maps from the abstract nature of the model to the concrete nature of reality is as simple as it possibly can be.
Yeah.
And so what I think we have with hypergraphs, not just hypergraphs, I would characterize it as multi-way rewriting based on combinatorial structures.
Yeah.
Of which hypergraphs just happen to be a very minimal and elegant example. For whatever reason, and I don't profess to understand it fully, we happen to have a model that's that's itself very minimal, but for which the encoding function from that model to a variety of phenomena in nature and in mathematics and in other things also seems to be very minimal. And maybe if you were being very speculative, you might say, well, maybe that's because it's telling us that it's somehow very close to the true ontology that nature is using. That might be true. I don't really know. I think it's a consequence of a combination of the fact that it's universal, it's capable of computational universality, and because it's so minimal and so structureless, because something like a cellular automaton or a Turing machine, of course, is also capable of universal computation. So you might ask, well, why can't you make the same argument for those? But as we mentioned at the beginning, they impose a lot of a priori structure, which immediately rules them out as being good models of certain kinds of systems, like in relativity. The fact that something like a hypergraph rewriting system has basically no a priori structure and is still capable of universal computation means that it's not ruling out as many things from the starting gate. Yeah. And so in a way, you might say it's kind of unsurprising that it's so extensible in its application.
Well, you've been incredibly generous with your time. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I'll put out a bunch of links in the show notes, but perhaps you can just give a brief overview. How can people connect with you?
Sure. Okay, well, first of all, let me say thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me to, first for making this happen, inviting me to come and speak here. It's been really fun. These questions are really great, and I really like what it is you're trying to do with the last theory. I think it's interesting, actually, that we had some, right when the project was first announced, we had a bunch of people trying to kind of popularize the ideas of it. But part of the problem was because it was just announced, we kind of didn't really know what we were doing, right? It was still, the project was still in pretty early stages. Yeah. We said a lot of things that were, in retrospect, kind of wrong. Now that it's starting to mature, we've got some more results, we've got some publications, etc. Now is really the time when I feel like we should be starting to popularize more, and I'm really glad that you're part of that effort. So thank you. This has been really great. Okay, in terms of how to reach me, so appliedcompositionality.com, that's the website for the new center. You can find my Wolfram Physics profile on wolframphysics.org. If you go to people, I'm listed there as one of the associate directors of research. So you can find some of my specific contributions to the Wolfram Physics Project there. In general, so I've been absent from Twitter for about a year, or a little bit more than a year, but I'm about...
That's very wise, I have to say.
Yeah, it probably was. I don't know, I felt like I think I just needed a social media break, but for various reasons, I think I'm about to start using Twitter again. If nothing else, because I think there are some things that the center is doing that I should probably start. I feel kind of obligated to start publicizing. So possibly fairly soon, reaching out to me on Twitter won't be a complete black hole like it has been for the last year or so. But also, my email address is publicly available on these various websites. As Mark will probably attest, I can be a little bit slow at responding to emails sometimes, but I have a policy. I will respond eventually. I know very few people who are good at responding to emails, but I'm probably worse than most. But if you write to me, I will reply. It just may not be immediate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate this. Thanks for joining me on The Last Theory.
Thanks so much. This is so much fun.